LoveLore Library. Chapter 113. It had taken Meg more than 50 days to make 2 servings of tofu pudding, 1 savory and 1 bland. If he could go back in time, he would definitely slap himself in the face. Don't compare yourself to others if you have nothing better to do. Back then, when he made those requests, he was simply forcing himself to a dead end. Even if he had the perfect experience of making tofu in his head, after thousands of continuous practice, even he himself wasn't very confident that he could pass the system's test. However, these 2 servings of tofu pudding were definitely the most perfect savory and sweet tofu pudding he had ever made. Regardless of whether it was the making of the tofu pudding, the mixing of the syrup and sauce, they were all perfect. The faint fragrance of the tofu pudding and the sauce wafted in the air, and he couldn't help but swallow his saliva. Those who liked sweet tofu pudding would be more interested in the sweet tofu pudding on the left. After all, even he had a slight desire to try the tofu pudding when he smelled the faint fragrance of the tofu pudding and the sweet but not greasy fragrance. Meg was a little nervous as he waited for the system's evaluation, but also a little expectant. When it came to cooking, the system had no intention of negotiating at all. This was one of his bottom lines. Meg also didn't want to use other means to complete the mission. He wanted every dish to be perfect. That was his attitude. The system was silent for a while before saying, according to the host's requirements, the evaluation results are as follows. 1. Color of the tofu pudding, white as jade, without any impurities, achieved. 2. Texture of the tofu pudding, tender as fat, melts in the mouth, with a faint fragrance of beans, achieved. 3. Side dishes, fresh and refreshing, well matched, achieved. 4. Sauce, translucent orange red, refreshing and delicious, fragrant but not greasy, achieved. Savory tofu pudding. The host didn't have any requirements for sweet tofu pudding in his previous life, but according to the system's evaluation, sweet tofu pudding has reached the level of savory tofu pudding. All 4 requirements have been met. Congratulations to the host for successfully learning how to make savory and sweet tofu pudding. Mission accomplished. Phew. Meg heaved a long sigh of relief, and a gratified smile appeared on his face. Since he had managed to meet the requirements of his previous life, his continuous efforts over the past few days had not been in vain. Next, he could make a delicious tofu pudding for Amy for breakfast. A bowl of savory tofu pudding and a lauge ruggiamo for breakfast. It was a perfect match. System, hurry up and let me go out to find it. I want to soak the soybeans. Meg didn't argue with the system. He looked at the savory tofu pudding on the table and wanted to give it a try. However, he forced himself to look away. All the scenes suddenly disappeared. Meg, who was lying on the bed, suddenly opened his eyes. Lying on the bed for a while, he turned on the bedside lamp and looked at the alarm clock. It was already 2:00 in the morning. Looks like I can make breakfast before the grand opening and give Amy a little surprise. A smile appeared on Meg's face. He got out of bed quietly, put on a coat, and prepared to go downstairs. Mother, is that you? Are you waiting for me? At this moment, Amy suddenly murmured. Meg's footsteps paused, and he slowly walked over to the bed. Amy was lying on the bed with her lips slightly pouted. Her eyes were closed, and her long eyelashes were trembling slightly. She looked a little surprised, but also a little conflicted and upset. But I don't even know what you look like. Can you turn around and let me see you? Just once, just once. Amy's voice became even more aggrieved. She raised her little hand outside the quilt as if she wanted to grab onto something. Meg gently held Amy's little hand, and his big warm hand wrapped around her little one. Good girl, Amy. Father is here. I'm here. Meg's heart sank. Although he had tried very hard to give her all his love and warmth, it seemed that she still missed her mother. After all, Amy was only a 4-year-old child. Other children could snuggle up in their mother's arms and act spoiled, but she had never seen her mother. Ugly Duckling had woken up at some point, and it also let out a soft cry. It licked Amy's arm through her clothes, and it also seemed to be a little worried. "Father." Amy slowly calmed down after her little hand was wrapped in Meg's big warm hand. She murmured to herself before falling asleep again. What happened back then? Where is she now? Meg put Amy's hand under the quilt and tucked it in. He stroked Ugly Duckling's head with furrowed brows. He stood by the bed in silence for a while. He looked at Amy's face, and secretly clenched his fists as he murmured to himself, "All right, I didn't want to get too involved with what happened back then, but it looks like I have to find Amy's mother. If she could be by her side, Amy would be happier than she is right now, right? Little girl, you've already learned to hide your feelings at such a young age. You're so sensible that it makes my heart ache." Meg went downstairs, and tried hard to recall his memories of the elven princess. However, he didn't know if Meg Alex had erased them himself, or if those people had tampered with his memories, but his memories of the elven princess were completely blank. He couldn't remember her voice, her appearance, or even her name. He only knew that she was the elven princess, and Amy's biological mother. From what those people did, I can tell that she was most likely forced. Otherwise, there would be no need for such a huge commotion to sever ties between the two of them. Meg pulled out a pen and paper from the counter, and wrote down a few names and powers on the paper. Chapter 114. Dragon-slaying warrior, Griffin Knight, Great General of the Empire. Meg Alex stood at the center of the storm with so many glorious titles. Both sides were equally matched, so his choice was basically the final decision. Even the king would consider the decision of this young general who was slowly becoming a pillar of the empire's military. It wasn't difficult for most people to guess his choice. No matter how they looked at it, there was no way that Meg Alex would choose to side with the second prince. The military and the Magus Tower had always hated each other, and the first prince had always been supportive of the military. He also had a good reputation among the marshals. With Meg's support, the balance of this battle for the throne seemed to be leaning toward the first prince's side. If that guy isn't in a hurry to act, it's hard to say who he'll choose. Meg tapped his pen between the second prince and the first prince. In his memory, the second prince gave off a very gentle feeling, while the first prince was too battle-hungry. However, he lacked intelligence, so he wasn't a good candidate to be the next king. Moreover, after that incident, the actions of the first prince's faction made him even more disappointed. They only sought to maximize the benefits of this matter, and no one cared about the safety of the father and daughter. It was similar to his evaluation of the first prince, heartless and unjust. As for the elven race, it was most likely the elven queen's orders. Otherwise, no one would have been able to take Amy away from the elven princess. The high-tier elven magic caster who appeared that day wasn't someone who could be easily mobilized. As for the demons, they were probably high-tier fighters hired by both sides to confuse the public and take the blame. After all, the entire incident was blamed on the demons. All the demons in Rodu were arrested and exiled after a thorough investigation. Both sides were at loggerheads, and a second large-scale war was about to erupt. The demon lord was probably going to vomit blood after being screwed over by those demons. As for why Meg didn't die even though all his meridians had been severed, the most important factor was probably Amy and the missing Princess Elven. As the only heir to the throne of the elven race, her status was even nobler than the second prince's. Even the elven queen had to take her feelings into consideration. She must be in the Wind Forest right now. I don't know if she's in seclusion or if she's trapped. She shouldn't be in any danger before the elf tribe finds a better successor. Meg drew a circle around the elf princess. Even with Meg Alex's strength, he was still in such a pitiful state. It wasn't easy for him to escape the surveillance of those people and come here, so naturally, he couldn't just go straight to her and expose his identity. He had to find an opportunity to find out more about the elves and her, and then see if there was a chance for Amy to meet her. If it wasn't for Amy missing her, Meg didn't want to get involved in this mess. But when he recalled Amy's aggrieved look, he couldn't bear to let her be sad and disappointed. The little girl was so sensible. When she was young, she once asked Meg where his mother went, but Meg didn't answer, so she didn't ask again. It turned out that he didn't forget, but hid it in the bottom of his heart. I'll dress up on my next day off and find a private detective agency to get some information about the elves. If I don't remember anything, I'll just have to get to know them again. Meg looked at the piece of paper in his hand. He put a cross on the Mage Tower, the first prince, the second prince, and the Elven Queen. Although he wasn't in a hurry to avenge Meg Alex, if there was a chance in the future, he didn't mind setting them up. He still remembered that someone suggested to kill him and Amy together that night. They better not give me the chance. Although I'm not interested in being the emperor, it's more interesting to support the third prince, who's obsessed with carpentry, than to let those two assholes take the throne. Meg curled his lips. He tore the piece of paper off, lit a fire, and threw it into the trash can. Watching it slowly turn to ashes, he turned around and walked towards the kitchen. There was a new pulping machine on the stove, and the second by G bread oven he bought from the system was also in place. Fortunately, when the system designed the restaurant, it left a lot of space in the kitchen. There were many empty seats. Now that all the kitchen utensils were added, it didn't feel crowded at all. Moreover, the utensils weren't fixed in place. They could be put away when they weren't needed. Meg walked to the refrigerator and took a look. The soybeans and other ingredients were already prepared. In this regard, the system was quite reliable. As for the price, Meg wasn't worried. In any case, the price was only 2 or 3 times the price of the ingredients. It was fine as long as he made more money than the system. Meg soaked the soybeans in a large bowl. Originally, he had only planned to make 2 servings and try it with Amy first. After hesitating for a moment, he grabbed a few more handfuls of soybeans, turned off the light, and went upstairs to sleep. Master Crassus, are you really going to build a magic lab in Chaos City? In an elegant room lit by an oil lamp, a thin middle-aged man was looking at Crassus, who was sitting at a desk and sketching something seriously. There was a small black tower badge on his chest. That was the symbol of the Roth Empire's holy tower. That's right, Arthur. Go back to Rodu first thing in the morning tomorrow and ask them to send all the things I need as soon as possible. Also, send all the things I have stored to me, untouched, Crassus said without looking up. He paused for a moment, and then put down his pen. He turned to Arthur with a serious expression and said, by the way, tell those old geezers that if one of the things I want is missing, I'll go back and tear down a floor of the Magus Tower. If 36 of them are missing, there won't be a Magus Tower in the Empire anymore. Yes. Arthur hurriedly nodded. He looked at Crassus, who had turned back to his drawing. He had been serving Master Crassus for 20 years. Perhaps very few people remembered this white-haired magic caster, but he was the only great magic caster in the Magus Tower who dared to fight a giant dragon in close combat with his staff. He had joined the Magus Tower at the age of 18, and was now over 120 years old. He had been serving Master Crassus since his grandfather's generation, and had been influenced by him since he was a child. He knew that Crassus lived on the 18th floor not because he was the 18th in the Magus Tower, but because he liked the number 18. If he wanted to, he could live on the 36th floor as well. 100 years ago, he was just as famous as General Alex had been a few years ago, and he had contributed greatly to the rapid rise of the Magus Tower's status over the past decade or so. It was just that he was past his prime. Arthur followed him all the way to the south to recruit disciples, but he didn't expect to stop here. It seemed that Crassus was planning to settle down here for the rest of his life, which made him feel a little complicated. Go. Prepare a carriage for me tomorrow morning. I want to go to Amy's early, said Crassus. Yes, Arthur replied and quietly went out. The light in the room flickered. After a long time, Crassus put down his pen and looked at the design of the magic room on the paper. A smile appeared on his old face. He got up and walked to the window. He looked at the half-hidden stars under the dark clouds and sighed to himself. Back then, Irina said that she would give birth to a daughter to be my disciple. I would teach her the most powerful magic and build the most beautiful magic room. Unfortunately, I'm afraid my body won't be able to wait until then. Fortunately, I've found a good little fellow. I just don't know if that little fellow will like it. Chapter 115. In a huge cave, there was a tree that was more than 100 meters tall. Its trunk was as thick as a dozen people hugging it. Countless branches began to branch out from the 50-meter-tall tree. Like a willow tree, thousands of thin and soft branches drooped down, almost filling the entire empty cave. Every branch had countless green heart-shaped leaves, which emitted a warm light green glow in the dark. They were full of vitality, and as the branches swayed slightly, they lit up the entire cave. There were also specks of fireflies dancing among the branches, making the cave look like a fairyland. Under this tree stood a woman in a white dress, looking up at a firefly perched on a leaf. Her long silver hair cascaded down her back, and her skin was fairer than snow. Her eyebrows were as delicate as a painting, and there was a small golden moon mark between her eyebrows. Her small pointy ears were white and thin, and seemed to be able to pass through light. Her brows were slightly furrowed, as if she was thinking about something. The branches around her automatically parted to the sides, as if they were afraid of her, but also seemed to want to get close to her. Your Highness Irina. At this moment, a crisp voice sounded from outside the cave, and an elven girl in a green dress quickly ran into the cave. The branches along the way seemed to be deliberately teasing her, constantly scraping her face and body. It took her a lot of effort to reach Irina. She was panting, but she couldn't hide the joy on her face. Irina was still staring at the firefly and calmly asked, Bean Sprout, what are you so happy about? Your Highness, didn't you say last time that you wouldn't use this nickname for me in the future? Phyllis's face fell, and she looked at Irina, who was standing under the tree of life, with a helpless expression. Although everyone around Her Highness had all kinds of strange nicknames, Bean Sprout was too unpleasant to hear. Irina turned her head, and stared at Phyllis's chest. She nodded seriously, and said, All right, Bean Sprout, but your chest has become smaller again. If this continues, it will become a pit. Your Highness, I'm still young. I'll grow up in the future. Phyllis said confidently after looking down at herself. I was already this big when I was 18, Irina looked into Phyllis's eyes and shook her head. I haven't changed since then. Your Highness, it's all right. I can hold on. Phyllis bit her lip as she tried to suppress her grief. It's okay. It's quite boring. If you want to cry, you can go to the side and cry for me. Irina smiled. Phyllis fell silent upon hearing this. She wanted to laugh and cry at the same time. As expected, she was so angry every time she spoke to His Highness, but she had no way to vent her frustrations. All of a sudden, her eyes lit up, and she said, Your Highness, I'm here to deliver some news to you. There's news from Rodu. What is it? Irina raised an eyebrow as she looked at Phyllis, and her voice involuntarily rose a few octaves. Phyllis knew that this was a sign of Her Highness' serious expression, and she replied in a quiet voice, "Snare sent back a secret report today. During the past 3 months, he's confirmed that he and the young mistress are most likely still alive. He used his talent to reconstruct the scenes around the fire scene, and he said that he'll report the details to you in person." "All right." Irina nodded with an expressionless face, but her fists were clenched tightly. She waved a hand at Phyllis and said, "If there's nothing else, you can go now. I don't want to see you cry right now. There's one more thing. Mistress Helena proposed to the Queen yesterday that we elect another elven princess as the heir. This time, she's recommending young Mistress Sally." Phyllis was a little concerned as she looked at Irina. "That old witch Helena's got a good eye this time. Slug is a good little girl. She used to follow me around a lot when I was a child." Irina nodded, but her voice suddenly became a little cold as she said, "But that old witch seems to be in a hurry to get on her way. Doesn't she know that if I want her to die, no one will be able to stop me?" The tree of life seemed to have sensed the change in her mood, and its branches began to sway as well. Phyllis lowered her head and didn't dare to say anything. Ever since Irina turned 18, the holy tree of the elven race had only obeyed her wishes. Here, she was invincible. Irina quickly calmed herself down and said, "You can go now." "Yes." Phyllis nodded before quickly making her way toward the entrance of the cave. The branches of the tree of life parted to create a path for her to quickly pass through. The sound of the stone door closing rang out, and the cave fell silent again. "Amy. Meg. Where are you two?" A murmur sounded in the quiet cave, and all of the branches of the tree of life floated upward, extending toward the sky like endless strands of hair. Countless fireflies gathered together and circled around Irina like a ribbon. Standing alone under the tree, she appeared to be a little lonely. The next morning, Meg woke up. Amy and Ugly Duckling were still sleeping soundly. Meg gently kissed Amy's forehead. If her mother could kiss her, she would be very happy, right? After standing and watching for a while, Meg went downstairs to prepare the ingredients. As usual, Yabamiya arrived at a little past 5 a.m. "Good morning, Mr. Mac." Yabamiya greeted Meg with a smile. Her smile was full of energy, and she didn't seem tired at all from yesterday's intensive work and waking up early. "Good morning, Mia. Didn't I tell you to come to the restaurant later?" Meg nodded and glanced at the half-eaten biscuit in her hand. "I'm used to waking up early, and I can't sleep, so I wanted to come early to help. I'll go to the restaurant after I finish eating." Yabamiya was a little embarrassed as she hurriedly stuffed the biscuit into her mouth. Because she ate too quickly, the biscuit got stuck in her throat, and she coughed a few times, her face a little red. "Come in, I'll get you some water," Meg said a little helplessly. He turned around and poured a glass of water for Yabamiya, who was still coughing. "Thank you." Yabamiya took 2 sips of the water and heaved a sigh of relief. She looked a little embarrassed. "Then take a seat first. I don't need your help for now, but I'll be making a new dish in a while. Maybe you can help me taste it." Meg smiled. He was already a good boss with such a salary and benefits during the probation period. When he wasn't in a hurry to save money next month, he could consider increasing Yabamiya's benefits. After all, this little girl was quite diligent. Yesterday, the restaurant's turnover increased by 30%, and his workload decreased by a lot. He had picked up a treasure. If she were an ordinary waiter, 2 of them wouldn't be able to be so efficient. "Okay." Although Yabamiya wanted to help, she looked at Meg's back and swallowed her words. She didn't have the confidence to help Meg do anything. Such delicious and magical food could only be made by his magical hands. Chapter 116. The soaked soybeans were almost ready. Meg prepared the ingredients for the rujiamo while grinding the soybeans in the grinder. He turned around and glanced at Yabamiya. He had put in more soybeans yesterday, so she could try the new dish and see if it suited the tastes of the people in this world. He put the ground soy milk into the pot, and the faint smell of soybeans drifted out of the kitchen. It smells so good. Yabamiya's eyes lit up. The aroma of soybeans in the air reminded her of when she was a child. Her mother would soak soybeans in a bowl for a night, add some oil and salt, and cook them in a pot. Soon, the aroma of soybeans would fill the air. The soybeans cooked in this way were fragrant and sweet. However, she hadn't eaten them for many years. Could it be that Mag's new dish was boiled soybeans? After ordering the tofu pudding, pouring the prepared syrup and sauce over it, and sprinkling the savory tofu pudding with all kinds of side dishes, Meg walked out of the kitchen with 2 bowls of tofu pudding. He placed them in front of Yabamiya and said with a smile, "The new dish is tofu pudding. Please try it." Tofu pudding. Yabamiya's eyes lit up as she looked at the 2 white porcelain bowls in front of her. There was something as white and soft as jade in each of the white porcelain bowls. When it was placed on the table, it wobbled slightly. It looked very elastic and very adorable. The bowl on the left was covered with fragrant syrup, while the bowl on the right was filled with all types of chopped side dishes. The faint aroma of tofu pudding and syrup wafted toward her, and she couldn't help but swallow as her gaze fell on the bowl of sweet tofu pudding with orange syrup, and she was unable to look away. The bowl on the left has sweet tofu pudding, and the bowl on the right has savory tofu pudding. You can choose according to your taste, Meg said. Judging from Yabamiya's expression, it wasn't hard to guess the result. But, it's not noon yet. Yabamiya looked between Meg and the tofu pudding in front of her. She was a little hesitant. This is a new dish that hasn't been officially sold yet. Tasting is also one of the jobs of the restaurant staff. You can choose. Meg shook his head with a smile. Naturally, he could guess her thoughts. Yabamiya's eyes lit up. She didn't expect that her job would include trying out new products. Although both bowls of tofu pudding looked delicious, the one on the left was clearly more appealing. She looked up at Meg and asked, "Then, can I choose the sweet one?" "Of course." Meg nodded with a smile, but he was feeling a little frustrated. He had never tasted tofu pudding before, yet he had chosen the sweet tofu pudding. But now, as the owner of the restaurant, he had decided not to participate in the dispute between the 2 parties. And now, he really began to try to understand everyone's different tastes. For example, Mabai ate Yangzhou fried rice every day without ever tasting a second rujiamo. Sargeras only ate rujiamo from the beginning to the end. This was something that he had seen with his own eyes after becoming the owner of the restaurant, and he had gradually come to understand it. Furthermore, the restaurant was going to sell both sweet and savory tofu pudding in the future, so it was completely within his expectations that there would be more customers who liked sweet tofu pudding. However, unlike in his previous life, where there was an accumulation of differences between the North and the South, the conflict between savory and sweet tofu pudding shouldn't be too exaggerated in this world. After receiving Meg's permission, Yabamiya carefully placed the sweet tofu pudding in front of her. She gently picked up the white spoon beside her and slowly dug in from the corner. It was like egg custard, but more springy. She dug into the tofu pudding that was covered by the golden red syrup with the spoon. The cut was as white as jade, but it was soon covered by the sticky syrup again. She slowly dug in a spoonful. The tofu pudding was wrapped in the crystal-clear syrup and slightly shook in the spoon. It was as delicate as a piece of art. "It's so beautiful." Yabamiya was a little entranced by the sight of the tofu pudding, but she couldn't help but put it into her mouth. The tender tofu pudding melted almost as soon as it entered her mouth, and the syrup that was wrapped around the tofu pudding was so rich and sweet that she couldn't help but close her eyes. What a sweet taste. This feeling of happiness made her feel as if she had suddenly fallen into a pool filled with candy. As long as she stretched out her hand, she would be able to grab the sweetest and most delicious candy. This had been her childhood dream. However, since she was young, candy had always been a luxury to her. There were too many days when she was hungry and did not even dare to hope for a sweet feeling. A tear rolled down Yabamiya's face and dripped onto the table. This feeling of happiness made her unable to control her emotions. She swallowed a mouthful of tofu pudding, but it didn't taste sweet at all. There was a faint taste of tofu pudding in her mouth, and it was sweet but not greasy. She opened her eyes and stared at the small bowl in front of her. She couldn't help but put another spoonful of tofu pudding into her mouth. The feeling of happiness was pushed to the peak by spoonful after spoonful. Ding! The spoon hit the bottom of the bowl, and Yabamiya opened her eyes. There was only a little orange syrup left in the bowl, and she faltered slightly upon seeing that she had already finished all of the tofu pudding. She couldn't help but lick the bottom of the bowl. The sweet syrup was simply too alluring. Was it good? Meg asked with an expectant look on his face. He could already guess the answer from Yabamiya's actions. The tofu pudding's debut in this world seemed to be quite good. Yes, it's super delicious. It's so sweet and soft, it's so delicious. Yabamiya put down the bowl with a blush on her face. She had already embarrassed herself by licking the plate 2 days ago, but the taste was simply too alluring, and she couldn't help but lick the bowl again. However, she still nodded vigorously. She paused momentarily before stroking her own face with elation. Also, my face feels cool, and my skin seems to have become even more supple. Does it have cosmetic effects as well? Meg was also a little surprised to hear this. He had been looking forward to seeing what additional effects the tofu pudding would have, but he didn't think that it would have cosmetic effects. This was an irresistible temptation for women, and if the tofu pudding's cosmetic effects were common, then it was entirely possible that it would become a must-order dish for all female customers. Do you want to try the salty one? Meg asked. Perhaps Yabamiya had only tasted the sweet tofu pudding first, and that was why Yabamiya found the sweet tofu pudding to be delicious. Perhaps she would be able to find her true faith after tasting the salty one. Chapter 117. That's a familiar tone. Meg raised an eyebrow. He had heard many similar comments on the internet in the past. He had expected someone to say it, but he didn't expect to hear it from Yabamiya first. Don't be so sure. Meg shook his head with a smile. He didn't think that the restaurant would have so many different tastes before the tofu pudding had even been released. However, he wasn't in a hurry to argue with Yabamiya. Instead, he sat down and picked up the bowl of savory tofu pudding from the table. The side dishes were all made according to his taste. The orange sauce was poured over the tender white tofu pudding, and he chopped up the pickled vegetables, sprinkled coriander, garlic, chopped green onions, and dripped 2 drops of sesame oil on top. The tofu pudding was still steaming hot. He scooped up a spoonful of tofu pudding and put it into his mouth. The tofu pudding slid down his tongue, and the flavor of the savory sauce and tofu pudding instantly fused together. A few simple side dishes were the finishing touches. Together with the sweet tofu pudding, it tasted so refreshing and delicious. After swallowing, the faint flavor of the tofu pudding lingered in his mouth for a long time. It was delicious but not greasy. This is even better than the Baiji tofu pudding on the Tianqiao Bridge in Nanjing City. This is the best tofu pudding can do. Meg's eyes completely lit up, and he couldn't stop eating. 3 minutes later, he slowly put down the spoon in his hand and looked at the empty bowl with a satisfied expression. A bowl of savory tofu pudding in the morning is really satisfying. It would be even better if it was paired with a rujiamo. Mia likes sweet tofu pudding, and I like savory tofu pudding. Now, it's time to see if Amy likes sweet or savory. Father, Amy is hungry. Right at this moment, Amy's voice sounded from behind him. She had come downstairs with Ugly Duckling in her arms. She sniffed with her little nose and looked at Meg with curiosity in her eyes. Father, is there something new today? Meg looked back at Amy, who had put on her dress, and stood up with a smile. Yes, there's something new today. Amy, have a seat, and I'll get you a bowl of tofu pudding. Do you want something sweet or savory? Tofu pudding. Salty or sweet? Amy's face showed a bit of hesitation. Amy, the sweet tofu pudding is super delicious. It's sweet and full of bliss, Yabamiya couldn't help but suggest. He's even using the great grass planting technique. Meg, who had been waiting for Amy to make her own choice, raised his eyebrows and thought about how to describe the savory tofu pudding's mesmerizing taste. Really? But the salty one must be super delicious too. Amy's eyes lit up. She looked at Meg and asked, Father, can I have both? Of course. Meg was stunned for a moment before a smile appeared on his face. That's right, this was Amy's choice. Under such circumstances, it was absolutely impossible to choose between the two. He just didn't know which flavor she would like more after eating it. All right, thank you, Father. Amy happily skipped over to the table with Ugly Duckling in her arms. She sat down at the table and opened her bright blue eyes wide with anticipation as she looked at Meg. She didn't know what tofu pudding was, but as long as it was made by her father, it would definitely be super delicious. Meg went into the kitchen, and soon came out with 2 bowls of tofu pudding. He placed them gently on the table and said, the one on the left is sweet, and the one on the right is savory. Which one would you like to have first, Meg? Yabamiya was also looking at Amy with anticipation in her eyes. She could tell that Mr. Mack preferred the savory tofu pudding, while she felt that the sweet tofu pudding had to be the most delicious food in the world. As such, she naturally hoped that Amy would like it as well. It smells so good. Amy fanned the opening of the bowl with her little hand, and her little face was filled with elation. Meow, meow, Ugly Duckling in Amy's arms also opened its mouth and let out a few meows. It crawled up against Amy's hand, wanting to see what was in the bowl. Don't look, Ugly Duckling. It's mine. Amy reached out and pressed Ugly Duckling's little head back down. Meow. Ugly Duckling looked up at Amy with a pitiful expression, its sapphire eyes filled with resentment. However, Amy completely ignored it as she looked at the 2 bowls. The white tofu pudding looked as if it had been made from snow, and both of them looked so adorable. She hesitated momentarily before moving the savory tofu pudding closer to her and picking up a small spoon. This is a victory for the savory side. A smile appeared on Meg's face. Sure enough, his daughter's tastes were just like his. As long as Amy tries the sweet tofu pudding, she'll definitely like it too. Yabamiya was a little disappointed, but she wasn't discouraged. She was determined. I'm going to eat it. Amy scooped up a spoonful of tofu pudding. The white tofu pudding was wrapped in orange-red sauce, and there was a bit of chopped pickled mustard on top. The tofu pudding looked very springy as it swayed in the spoon. She opened her mouth and put it into her mouth. The sweet tofu pudding, the savory mustard, and the sauce blended perfectly together, and her eyes immediately lit up. She swallowed it with a soft gulp. Amy's little face was filled with joy as she looked up at Meg, who was full of anticipation. She nodded her little head, and said, Father, the tofu pudding is delicious, but can I have a rujiamo to go with it? Sure, I'll make it for you. Meg nodded. He also thought that the savory tofu pudding would go well with rujiamo, but he didn't expect Amy to ask for Ruggiemo before he even said anything. Foodies are really talented. Is it really that delicious? Yabamiya was a little skeptical as she looked at Amy, who was happily eating another spoonful of tofu pudding. However, her eyes fell on the bowl of sweet tofu pudding next to her, and her gaze became firm again. Sweet tofu pudding is the best. The baiji bread was already in the oven, and the braised meat was already cooked. Soon, 2 ruggiamos were made, and a savory tofu pudding was made for herself. Amy took a bite of the ruggiemo, and then a bite of the tofu pudding. Her eyes were wide open, and her little face was filled with happiness. Her body was also swaying from side to side, and she looked very happy. Ugly Duckling's head swayed from side to side as Amy ate, and its eyes were filled with longing. Meg also had a smile on his face. At least for now, it seemed that Amy liked savory tofu pudding. There were a few more urgent knocks on the door. Meg looked at his watch. It was only 7 o'clock, and he wasn't going to open the door. Chapter 118. Meg put down his ruggiemo, walked to the door, and opened it. A tall, thin man in a black robe and a black hat that almost covered his eyes stood at the door. Hearing the door open, he looked sideways at Meg and said nervously in a low voice, "May I come in?" Meg looked at the familiar face and nodded. He stepped aside to let him in and closed the door behind him. This was the boss of the private detective agency he had visited the day before yesterday. He had asked him to investigate Crassus and Julian. The boss' name was Sherlock, which was why he had chosen this agency. He hadn't expected Sherlock to come to him in just 2 days. "Mr. Mack, this is the information you asked for. I don't know what you want, but I suggest you don't provoke these two." Sherlock took out a paper bag and handed it to Meg. He glanced at Yabamiya and Amy in the dining room and lowered his voice again. "It's not hard to get information on Crassus. It's very detailed, and it's worth the price you paid. But I didn't find much information on the magician next door. When he entered the magic potion shop last night, half of his hair was burned. He's a very powerful magician." I glanced at Sherlock's short burnt hair that was exposed from the edge of his hat. 2 days ago, Sherlock had long, curly hair, a mustache, and an unrestrained smile. It was a stark contrast to Sherlock's cautious and slightly white hair. I wondered what Sherlock had experienced the previous night. "Okay, thank you." Meg nodded and squeezed the paper bag in his hand. There seemed to be a lot of information. It should be enough for him to determine how dangerous Crassus and Julian were. Sherlock, who had long, flowing hair, had done his best. "Then I'll take my leave." Sherlock nodded and prepared to leave. But when his eyes fell on Amy, who was eating a ruggiemo, he couldn't help but stop. He had seen the little girl 2 days ago. She was delicate and adorable. Now, she was chewing on a weird-looking biscuit, and scooping up a spoonful of white and tender food from the bowl from time to time. She was eating with relish. The aroma of braised meat and beans in the air made him swallow involuntarily. He had been in a hurry to deliver the ingredients to Mag before he opened the magic potion shop, so he hadn't had breakfast yet. When he smelled this tempting aroma, his stomach began to growl unconsciously. "Mr. Mack, can we start selling breakfast now?" Sherlock asked Meg. "There's still half an hour before the opening, so we don't serve breakfast yet." Meg shook his head, but there was a strange smile on his face. He had paid Sherlock 10 gold coins as a commission. If he used that money to eat in the restaurant, it wouldn't even be enough for 2 bowls of Yangzhou fried rice. He wondered how Sherlock would feel about his flowing hair. "Okay, I guess I'll have to come again next time. Goodbye." Sherlock nodded. He took another look at the ruggiemo in Amy's hand and opened the door. Meg locked the door and sat down at the table by the door. He took out the information in the paper bag and quickly browsed through it. His brows furrowed, then slowly relaxed. Finally, he became hesitant. The information on Crassus was indeed very detailed. From when he was young, to when he left Rhodu and went all the way south to Chaos City, there was a record of where he lived now. But after all, he was a magic caster worshipped by the imperial family. The fact that Sherlock could get such information meant that he had a good source of information. From this information, he could basically rule out the connection between Crassus and that incident. This made him feel relieved. As long as he didn't belong to that faction, Crassus was much less dangerous. What concerned Meg more was that Crassus had a relationship with the elven princess. It seemed that he wanted to take her as his disciple, but the matter was left unsettled. Therefore, he should be kind to the elven princess. The information on Julian was much less. It only said that he was a mysterious magic caster who had opened this magic potion shop in the Aiden Square for nearly 10 years. The business of the magic potion shop had been lukewarm. It produced all kinds of low-level magic potions, which could be sold in bulk. Therefore, many adventurers would buy some basic potions from him. He was very low-key. However, Sherlock mentioned that Julian might have some grudges with Crassus, but it was only briefly mentioned. Maybe he didn't know enough, or he was afraid of Crassus. If that's the case, Crassus is less dangerous than the mysterious Julian. Meg frowned. According to the information, Crassus wanted to find a disciple to inherit his legacy. He was already 121 years old, and his life was coming to an end. Therefore, finding a disciple was more important to him than anything else. He knew that Amy was a half-elf, but he still wanted to take her as his disciple. It was clear that taking a disciple was more important to him than anything else, even if it was the doubts of the secular world and the problems that might arise in the Magus Tower. If he really wants to take Amy as his disciple, but doesn't want to go to the Magus Tower. Meg's mind began to run wild. Father, the savory tofu pudding is delicious. Amy's happy voice interrupted Meg's thoughts. He smiled and put the information back into the paper bag. He got up and walked over. Amy had already finished her rugiamo and savory tofu pudding. She raised her head, and her eyebrows were like crescent moons. Is Amy's favorite savory tofu pudding? Meg asked with a smile as he reached out and gently wiped away a bit of tofu pudding from the corner of her mouth. But I also want to try that sweet tofu pudding. I think it'll be super delicious too. Amy shook her head. Her eyes were shining as she looked at the tofu pudding with golden red syrup. When I'm almost full, I'll have a sweet tofu pudding like a dessert. It'll definitely feel great. Okay, then you can try it. Meg nodded. He was a little exasperated by Amy's eagerness to eat any delicacy, but what could he do? She was so adorable even when she wanted to eat sweet tofu pudding. He carefully moved the bowl of sweet tofu pudding toward her. A look of anticipation appeared on Yabamiya's face. She had thought that Amy wouldn't eat sweet tofu pudding because she liked savory tofu pudding, but it appeared that wasn't the case. Perhaps she would fall in love with sweet tofu pudding. Amy scooped a spoonful of sweet tofu pudding into her mouth, and closed her big blue eyes. The tofu pudding was coated in syrup, and it melted in her mouth, filling her mouth with sweetness. Chapter 119. The restaurant was so quiet that they could hear Amy gulp down the tofu pudding. The sweet tofu pudding is delicious too. Amy opened her eyes and said happily. She scooped another spoonful of tofu pudding into her mouth, one spoonful after another. She couldn't stop, and her little face was full of joy. If that's the case, which one do you like more? Meg raised his eyebrows. Amy's expression was almost the same when she ate the sweet tofu pudding and the savory tofu pudding. But come to think of it, Amy's expression was almost the same when she ate the Yangzhou fried rice and rujiamo for the first time. She was completely intoxicated by the delicious food, and the pure smile on her face made her delicate little face look even cuter. After a while, Amy licked the bottom of her empty bowl and put it down reluctantly. Amy, do you think the savory tofu pudding is better or the sweet tofu pudding is better? Meg asked Amy with a smile. I think. Amy looked at Meg and Yabamiya, who were looking at her nervously. She thought for a while and nodded. Both are good. The savory tofu pudding can be eaten with rujiamo. The savory tofu pudding makes the rujiamo even better. The sweet tofu pudding can be eaten after the savory tofu pudding and rujiamo. The sweet tofu pudding is just right for the end. I feel so satisfied and comfortable after eating it. Tofu pudding, both savory and sweet, is super delicious. Meg and Yabamiya looked at each other helplessly. They had thought that Amy would be on their side, but Amy actually thought both were super delicious. Now they were on their side. The savory side and the sweet side were equally divided. If the savory side and the sweet side fought in the future, they would probably be closer to Amy. Mr. Mac, I'm Crassus. I have something to tell you. Can you let me in first? Just then, there was a knock on the door. It's Half-Beard Grandpa. Amy looked toward the door and said happily, Father, can you give Half-Beard Grandpa a helping of tofu pudding? I think he'll definitely like the sweet tofu pudding. He's so old, and most of his teeth must have fallen out. The soft tofu pudding won't take much effort to eat. I'll go open the door first. We haven't started selling the tofu pudding yet. Meg shook his head with a smile. He had just finished reading Crassus' information, and his hostility towards him had lessened a lot. The relationship between Crassus and the elven princess had made his mind a little more lively. Perhaps Crassus' identity would allow him to come into contact with some more secret information, which would be more reliable than the detective society that relied on blind guesses. Julian. Why are you here? Just as Meg was about to open the door, Crassus' voice sounded from outside. He sounded surprised and angry. Julian was the name of the old magician of the magical potion shop next door. In the information that Sherlock had given him, it mentioned that Crassus and Julian might have a grudge against each other. Now, it seemed that the information was accurate. The two of them did know each other, and their grudge was probably not shallow. Crassus, I've been living here for almost 10 years. If you can be here, why can't I be here? Julian sneered. His voice was hoarse, like two rusty pieces of metal rubbing against each other. It was unbearable to listen to. That's right. That's right. Charcoal's voice rang out, and he chimed in. You hairless bird, call out one more time, and you'll be cooked. Crassus glanced at Charcoal and said calmly, but he was looking at Julian from the corner of his eye. He was angry and anxious. Why is this old thing here? Is he just here for a meal? Or is he interested in Amy's talent and wants to take her as his disciple? I'm not afraid of you, Charcoal said, but his voice was obviously lacking in confidence. He moved timidly to the back of the cage, closer to Julian. You have no right to teach my bird a lesson. Julian's voice was cold. He looked at Crassus with a gloomy gaze, and the surrounding temperature seemed to drop. I don't care who raised the fella I want to teach a lesson to. When the king was still the crown prince, I taught him a lot of lessons. Crassus also retorted with an imposing manner, and the air around them began to heat up. Ding dong. The bell rang. Meg opened the door, and Crassus and Julian turned their heads at the same time. If the two of you want to fight, please do it outside. The restaurant is still open for business later. It would be bad if the door was frozen or burned. Meg stood on the dividing line between the two as soon as he opened the door. He experienced the feeling of ice and fire, and looked at the two who were at daggers drawn, and shrugged helplessly. Crassus was still holding that tall staff in his hand, and his white magician robe was spotless. Julian was wearing a pitch-black magician's robe, holding a short magic wand in one hand and a birdcage in the other. Charcoal, who had 2 leaves covering his body, was hiding in a corner, trembling. Crassus and Julian looked at Meg in shock. With their status and power, even if they were to fight in front of the Rhoda Palace, the king might not dare to come out and ask them to fight further away to avoid damaging the palace gate. They didn't expect Meg to come out and ask them to fight further away instead of trying to stop them. This reason could be considered very fresh and refined. Crassus and Julian looked at each other. They hesitated for a moment, and then retracted their auras almost at the same time. Mr. Mac. The two of them looked at Meg, and spoke at the same time. Then, they stopped at the same time and stared at each other. Come in and talk. Meg looked at the two who were about to fight again, and said helplessly. It wasn't hard to guess their intentions. It seemed like Julian also wanted to take Amy as his disciple. All right. Crassus nodded, and entered the restaurant first. Julian hesitated for a moment, and then nodded and followed him in. Meg closed the door and lowered the blinds at the same time. Since finding a magic teacher for Amy from Chaos School wouldn't work, he might as well try to get in touch with Crassus and Julian officially first. Crassus' resume could be said to be glorious. He was the only magic caster on the Norland continent who could use a magic caster's staff to kill a giant dragon. Although there wasn't much information on Julian, he dared to fight Crassus without losing out. It was clear that he wasn't weaker than Crassus, and he didn't seem to have anything to do with the Magus Tower. Crassus stopped in his tracks, and turned back to look at Julian seriously. Julian, you ruined my plan to take Irina as my disciple 20 years ago. If you still want to make trouble this time, I will smash your head into pieces even if I have to risk my life. 5th update, brothers, please subscribe. The rewards have already exceeded 3,000. 2 alliance leaders. 2 elders. And a lot of rewards. Thank you very much, and very excited. Happy New Year to everyone. Chapter 120. Hee, Crassus, do you think I'm that stupid dragon? Don't ruin my plans this time. Otherwise, I'll seal you in ice again, Julian chuckled coldly in a bone-chilling voice. Irina. Meg raised an eyebrow as he murmured the name in his mind. He felt that this name was a little familiar, and his eyes suddenly lit up as he looked at the two of them who were about to draw their swords again. According to Crassus' information, 20 years ago was when he wanted to take the elven princess as his disciple, but the matter was left unsettled. However, judging from the current situation, this matter seemed to have something to do with Julian, so this Irina was very likely to be the elven princess. You're here, Black Coal. Where's Green Bean? Amy jumped down from her chair and looked at Black Coal with elation. Ugly Duckling glared at Black Coal and opened its mouth to meow, looking as if it was about to pounce on him. That guy is the laziest. He's still sleeping, Black Coal said with disdain. Charcoal said with a little disdain. He glanced at Crassus and took 2 steps back in fear. He had never seen such a terrifying old man. His whole body was emitting a dangerous aura. All right. Amy nodded before turning to look at Julian and Crassus, who were about to fight again. She was a little perplexed as she said, Grandpa Turtle, Grandpa Halfbeard, are you two going to fight? You can't do it in the restaurant. You have to be good. No, we're just chatting. Crassus immediately shook his head with a smile. His expression was as obedient as it could be. Julian hesitated momentarily before forcing a smile and nodding. Yes, we're not fighting. We're not fighting. Amy was a little disappointed. She tried to suggest, actually, if you want to fight, you can fight outside. That way, I can watch. Crassus and Julian were both speechless. Not only was this little girl not trying to stop them from fighting, she was even instigating them to fight just to watch the show. Her strange way of thinking reminded them of the same person. Back in the day, that little girl also liked to stir up trouble like this. She wanted them to fight all day long. Do you two have something to say? Meg asked as he stroked Amy's hair with a smile. Although he also wanted to watch the two great magic casters fight, it was clearly not the right time. If he guessed correctly, these two were most likely here for Amy. Otherwise, they wouldn't be so humble. Mr. Mac, I'm here today. I want to take Amy as my disciple. Seeing Mag frown, he quickly raised his hand and said, "Don't be in such a hurry to refuse. You said you don't want the little girl to leave your side, so I'll change my condition. She doesn't need to go to Rodu. I've decided to build a new magic lab in Chaos City, and teach her magic here. I believe there are few teachers in Chaos City, or even the entire Norland continent, who are better than me. You want her to stay in Chaos City?" Meg's eyes lit up. Just as Crassus had said, he was most disgusted by Crassus' insistence on taking Amy back to the Magus Tower. However, if he could stay in Chaos City, then combined with the information he had received in the morning, there really weren't many magic casters on the entire Norland continent who were more powerful than Amy. Crassus was also quite elated to see Meg's expression change. After the past few days, he could tell that Meg's decision was the key. "Yes, but one of them happened to be here," Julian said in a leisurely manner. He looked at Meg, and forced a smile onto his face as he said, "Mr. Mac, if you want Amy to learn magic from me, I have a ready-made magic room. She can start learning today. The materials for the magic room have to be shipped over from Rodu, so it'll take at least a month for it to be completed. During this month, I can give her a comprehensive understanding of magic, and she can learn at least 3 types of magic at the same time. This is a clear win for me. This condition." Meg stroked his chin with a thoughtful expression. In reality, he was already overjoyed. 2 great magic casters were trying to promote themselves here in order to compete for a disciple. For a moment, one would think that 2 teachers from 2 different schools were competing for a high-quality student. The magic room isn't a problem at all. The requirements for a magic room for beginners don't need to be too high. I just have to inform the Grey Temple, and I can borrow their magic casters to start teaching. Crassus waved his hand, and pulled out a scroll from his pocket. He slowly unfurled it on the table, and looked at Amy with a smile as he said, "Also, I've designed the new magic room for Amy. There's only one of its kind on the entire Norland continent. It'll be mainly purple, and there'll be swings, wooden horses, and other fun things. You can play with it when you're tired." "Wow, it looks so interesting." Amy walked up with Ugly Duckling in her arms. She looked at the beautiful magic room in the drawing. There were swings, wooden horses, and all kinds of interesting toys. The purple magic room was dotted with all kinds of little stars, and it looked so dreamy that her eyes lit up completely. Meg was also a little surprised to see that drawing. This was just a drawing to show the effects. He didn't expect that Crassus would put in so much effort just to take Amy as his disciple. He was a little surprised by how much importance he attached to the design. "What's the use of all these fancy things?" Julian poked his head out to take a look, and his expression was a little unnatural. He looked at Amy, and said anxiously in his heart, "Old man Ku is so shameless." He came prepared. He used this trick many years ago, and I didn't expect him to use the same trick again. This little girl doesn't have Irina's knowledge. she won't be able to resist seeing these little things. His gaze landed on the birdcage in his hand, and his eyes lit up instantly. He looked at Amy with a smile, and said, "Amy, if you learn magic from me, then black coal and green pea will be yours. They can play with you every day and talk to you to relieve your boredom." "Wow! Old man, are you selling me out just like that?" "Little Amy has a cat." Black coal screamed, and jumped up and down in the cage anxiously. "Meow." Ugly Duckling bared its teeth at Black Coal with an eager expression. Black Coal was even more terrified. Although it was still a little guy, he wasn't sure if he could really beat it if they really fought. "I don't want it. Ugly Duckling is ugly enough, and Black Coal is even uglier. What if Amy becomes ugly because of their influence?" Amy looked at Black Coal with disdain. "That's right. Look at that bird. It's obviously not a good bird. If you like birds, Grandpa will go and catch a beautiful golden peacock for you tomorrow." Crassus was originally worried that Amy would be tempted, but after hearing what she said, he was immediately happy, and said proudly. Julian's expression froze, and he looked at Black Coal. It was bald all over, and it did look a little ugly with 2 leaves tied to its chest and back. However, he couldn't drop the ball at such a crucial moment. He laughed dryly, and said, "Although Black Coal is a little ugly, it can sing. It's really fun. Come, sing a few lines." "Really?" Amy looked at Black Coal with disbelief. In just half a day, the restaurant had already entered the premium category, and gave Chinyu a surprise for the beginning of the year. "Thank you very much." Before the restaurant went up for sale, it had already been agreed that there would be 10 updates. Chinyu would continue to write now, and she would publish them one by one in the evening. She would write 1 chapter, and update 1 chapter. The 10 chapters today weren't counted as updates, and she would like to thank everyone for their support. Today, there were 2 new alliance leaders, 1 sect leader, 1 elder, and 4 branch leaders. There were 17 more chapters to be updated today. Then, she would like to ask for monthly votes here. This month's monthly votes ranking was really very important to the restaurant. Furthermore, there were double monthly votes from the 1st to the 7th of this month. There were already more than 900 monthly votes now, and there were 3 more chapters to be updated. His white magician's robe fluttered in the absence of wind, and the blue gem on his staff was dancing with fire. He had come here full of confidence to impress Meg and Amy with his sincerity. Then, he would be able to accept them as his disciple. But he didn't expect Julian to come out of nowhere and try to steal his disciple. Nonsense. If it weren't for your shameless sneak attack, how could a 10th tier magic caster be a match for me? After that, I would freeze you into a popsicle. If it weren't for Irina, you would still be soaking in the well south of Rodu. Julian's face darkened upon hearing this. Frost appeared under his feet, and flowers of frost bloomed on the floor, spreading in all directions. The situation suddenly became tense. The confrontation between ice and fire was formed once again. Chapter 122. Tofu Pudding. Crassus and Julian both looked confused. They looked at Amy, who had a serious expression on her face, and hesitated for a moment. After all, they were in Meg's restaurant, and if they accidentally destroyed the restaurant, they wouldn't be able to take Amy as their disciple. The 2 of them looked at each other. Although the old grudge was irreconcilable, the most important thing now was to make Amy happy and choose him as her master. Things like fighting could be settled privately at a time and place. The 2 of them had lived for more than 200 years, so they still had the patience and state of mind. "Mr. Mac, is this tofu pudding a new dish from the restaurant?" Crassus looked at Meg with a smile. This was the first time he had heard of this dish. Right now, the conditions that both parties proposed were at odds with each other. In such a situation where both parties were evenly matched, the choice was completely in Mag's hands. Hence, the most direct and simple method was to curry favor with Mag as much as possible. "Boss Mag, your restaurant's business is so good, so your dishes must be very delicious. Give me a portion first." Urian reacted quickly, and he turned to Mag. Meg naturally knew what the two of them were thinking. He still had a few servings of tofu pudding left, but he didn't plan to sell it today. However, now that Amy had mentioned it, he was also a little curious about whether Crassus and Julian would like tofu pudding, so he hesitated for a moment before looking at the two of them and saying, "Tofu pudding is a new dish from the restaurant, but it hasn't been officially sold yet. Since the two of you want to try it, then treat it as a trial. Tofu pudding comes in 2 flavors, savory and sweet. Which flavor would you like?" Host, the system suggests that you don't let customers try it for free. The system doesn't provide free ingredients. The cost of a bowl of tofu pudding is as follows. The system's voice sounded in Meg's mind. Alright, let's just talk about the cost of the ingredients. In the future, one of them might be Amy's magic teacher, so what's wrong with treating them to a bowl of tofu pudding? Besides, how can one bowl of tofu pudding be enough? "I'll earn the money back by the time they have their second bowl," Mag said with a hint of mockery. "System, you're too narrow-minded and narrow-minded. You're not going to be able to do anything." The system fell into silence. After a while, a line of words appeared, 1 set of sweet and savory tofu pudding ingredients, 40 copper coins. If the production cost is 40 copper coins, then it should sell for 200 copper coins per bowl. Meg thought to himself. After all, this tofu pudding had a certain beautifying effect, and it was destined to drive women crazy. If the price was set too low, it wouldn't be worth it. "I want something sweet. I want salty." Crassus and Julian spoke almost at the same time. They looked at each other and sat down at 2 adjacent tables. They chose something different. Amy's eyes lit up. Father's tofu pudding was so delicious. No matter if it was sweet or savory, they would definitely like it. The sweet one is the best. This old magic caster has a better taste, Yabamiya thought to herself as she looked at Crassus with admiration. "Okay, please wait a moment." Meg nodded. When he turned around, his expression became a little strange. He didn't expect that the two would choose something different without even thinking about it. The two of them sat quietly. They weren't in a hurry to get close to Amy. Their conditions were similar, and their abilities were similar. It was a little similar to the situation in the past, so before they were confident, they couldn't act too anxious. "What kind of food will this tofu pudding be?" "Mr. Max Yongzhou fried rice is delicious, and many people like Rujiamo. Since little Amy recommended it, it must be delicious. It would be even better if it was sweet." Crassus looked at the kitchen expectantly. Recently, he had been coming to the restaurant every day not only because he wanted to take Amy as his disciple, but also because he had completely fallen in love with the taste of Yongzhou fried rice. This was also an important reason why he had decided to stay in Chaos City for the rest of his life. He wouldn't be able to taste such delicious food when he returned to Rodu. Meanwhile, Urian was looking around the restaurant. The restaurant had been open for a few days, but this was the first time that he had visited it. The decor was indeed quite nice. Even though it couldn't be described as extravagant, it was very much to his liking. There weren't any fancy decorations. Looking at the menu on the table, Julian remembered that Amy had said she wanted to eat in his restaurant. He put down the birdcage in his hand, picked up the menu, and flipped it open. He was stunned when he saw the menu. There were only 2 dishes on such a big menu. When he saw the prices, his expression became a little strange. A plate of Yangzhou fried rice cost 600 copper coins, a plate of Laji Rujiamo cost 300 copper coins, and a bottle of intermediate recovery potion only cost 10 gold coins. That was not even enough for 2 plates of Yangzhou fried rice, which he had no idea what it was. Could it be that they're working together to cheat me? Urian took a glance at Amy. Normally, there would be a long line outside the restaurant, so he had thought that the restaurant would be able to attract so many customers in such a short period of time because of its cheap and delicious food. However, there was no way that a restaurant with only 2 dishes could attract so many customers at such exorbitant prices. Forget it. If I can get a good disciple, a few thousand copper coins a day is nothing. At most, I can make a few more bottles of high-grade potions. Urian quickly withdrew his gaze, and turned toward the kitchen. The faint aroma of beans wafted through the air, intermingled with a unique aroma of meat. It was different from all the meat that he had tasted in the past, and he couldn't help but look forward to what it was. Meow, meow. Ugly Duckling looked at the birdcage that Julian put on the ground, and immediately became excited. It called out to Black Coal in the cage, and licked Amy's hand. It seemed to be in a hurry to get down. Ugly Duckling, do you want to play with Black Coal? Amy asked softly. Ugly Duckling immediately nodded and scratched its little paws excitedly. Don't come down if you dare. Black Coal looked at Ugly Duckling nervously. Meow, meow. Ugly Duckling became even more excited. Amy squatted down and put Ugly Duckling on the ground, and said seriously with a serious expression, "All right, you two have to get along well. Adorable Princess Amy, can I stay in your arms for a while?" Black Coal looked at Ugly Duckling, who was walking over lightly with a mouth full of sharp little teeth, and immediately cowered. He looked at Amy with a pleading expression. "No, you don't have a single hair on your body. I don't want to hug you." Amy shook her head decisively. Chapter 123. The tofu pudding was still steaming hot, and there were 2 small white ceramic bowls with a white spoon beside them. This is... Crassus's eyes lit up as he looked at the small bowls in front of him. The faint aroma of tofu pudding wafted into his nose. It was the aroma of crushed soybeans. What surprised him even more was the thing in the bowl. It was square and white, and there was a layer of reddish-golden syrup on top. It looked like a pure white jade wrapped in amber, but it shook a little when it was put down, so it looked very elastic. The aroma of the hot syrup mixed with the aroma of the soybeans made him feel the sweetness in his mouth even before he tasted it. For someone who loved desserts, it was simply too tempting. Humph, it's so sweet. Aren't you afraid of being sick of it? Julian pursed his lips, and his eyes also lit up as he looked at the tofu pudding in front of him. The same square and white tofu pudding was placed in a small bowl, and there were chopped pickled vegetables and other side dishes on top. A spoonful of reddish-orange sauce was poured over the tofu pudding, and the aroma of the sauce and side dishes mixed with the aroma of the soybeans wafted into his nose. It was simply too tempting. It's salty, but it looks very appetizing. It should be delicious, Julian thought to himself, and he was also looking forward to it. The 2 of them picked up their spoons at almost the same time and put a spoonful into their mouths. Meg, Amy, and Yabamiya all stood quietly off to the side, looking at the 2 of them with curiosity. They wanted to know which flavor of tofu pudding tasted better to them. This taste. Crassus' eyes widened. The tofu pudding wrapped in a layer of syrup melted in his mouth. The soft and fragrant tofu pudding paired with the sweet syrup was different from the usual sticky syrup. This reddish-golden syrup was sweet but not greasy, and it didn't cover up the natural aroma of the tofu pudding either. He swallowed it down his throat, and there was still a faint aroma of soybeans lingering in his mouth. There was a hint of sweetness, and there was a rich aftertaste. This is made from soybeans, right? But how can soybeans be made to be so soft and tender? I don't even need to chew, it melts in my mouth. And this syrup is very special. Even though it's sweet, it doesn't feel greasy at all. After swallowing it, I actually feel quite refreshed. Crassus looked at Meg with countless questions in his mind. He couldn't stop eating, and he just couldn't get tired of it. It's delicious. How could there be such delicious food in this world? Urian stared at the empty spoon in front of him, completely rooted to the spot. The white and tender tofu pudding was wrapped in reddish-orange syrup, and there was a bit of chopped pickled mustard on top. When he put it into his mouth, it melted without chewing. The sweet tofu pudding, the savory pickled mustard, and the syrup blended together perfectly, stimulating his taste buds. It was as if every grain was jumping for joy. After swallowing it, there was a faint bean aroma in his mouth, and he felt refreshed. Crassus had eaten Yangzhou fried rice many times in the past, and he was looking forward to the tofu pudding. However, today was Julian's first time in the restaurant, and it was his first time tasting Meg's food. The impact was so great that he couldn't help but put another spoonful into his mouth, and a joyful smile appeared on his wrinkled face. It seems that everyone is quite satisfied. A smile also appeared on Meg's face. The smiles on Crassus and Urian's faces weren't fake at all. Seeing that his food was being recognized and brought joy to his customers, his mood also improved. Ding! Dang! Crassus and Julian finished their bowls of tofu pudding at almost the same time. They looked at the empty bowls in front of them, and their expressions were as if they hadn't had enough. Boss, another bowl of savory tofu pudding. It's so delicious. Julian put down the spoon in his hand, and looked at Meg with a slightly excited expression. Sweet tofu pudding is the best. Crassus glanced at Julian, and then looked at Meg. Mr. Mac, can I have another bowl of sweet tofu pudding as well? I'll pay for it. Just name a price. What's so good about sweet tofu pudding? You're not a child. You're over 100 years old, and you still like sweet tofu pudding. Julian looked at Crassus with undisguised disdain. What's so good about savory tofu pudding? Savory tofu pudding goes best with sweet tofu pudding. A heretic like you should be roasted over a fire. You can't even understand the feeling of sweet tofu pudding sliding down your throat. Crassus held his magic caster's staff, and glared at Julian. Specks of red light condensed on his magic caster's staff, and it looked like he was really angry. Bullshit. Your sweet tofu pudding is the heretic. Savory tofu pudding is the true flavor. You can't even imagine how delicious tofu pudding with sauce and chopped up with all kinds of side dishes will be. Julian's voice also rose a few octaves. Frost appeared under his feet again, and the temperature around him dropped a few notches. I'm sorry, tofu pudding isn't officially on sale today, and I didn't plan to try it, so I don't have a second bowl. Meg had a strange expression on his face as he looked at the two people who were about to fight to the death over a bowl of tofu pudding. This was probably the first battle between sweet and savory in this alternate world. He didn't expect that the two of them, who had come for Amy, would divert their attention over a bowl of tofu pudding. In his previous life, the battle between sweet and savory basically existed on all kinds of forums and Weibo, and the keyboard was the only weapon. No matter how fierce the argument was, it wasn't to the point of actually fighting. However, the situation was different now. Crassus and Julian were arguing, and it looked like they were about to fight to prove their favorite tofu pudding's name. Sweet tofu pudding is delicious, Yabamiya murmured softly, and only she could hear her own voice. It's so delicious, so why are they fighting over it? Amy looked at the two of them with a conflicted expression on her little face. She was a little puzzled. Nothing else. Crassus and Julian were a little disappointed when they heard that. The two of them looked at each other at the same time, and they both looked a little angry. The anger that had been building up over fighting for a disciple finally exploded after a bowl of tofu pudding fermented it. Julian, you heretic, I've been annoyed with you for a long time. Let's fight fair and square. See if I don't break your skull. Crassus stood up with the help of his magic caster's staff, and glared at Julian. Humph. Crassus, do you think I'm afraid of you? I'm going to freeze you and throw you into the moat to feed the fishes. Julian also stood up with a hoarse voice, and his expression was a little gloomy. So, you two are going to fight over which one is better? Amy asked curiously as she looked at the two of them. After a pause, she clapped her little hands and said, then hurry up and start. It's fine as long as you don't fight in the restaurant. Originally, I said I would update 10 chapters, but I cultivated too late last night, and I've been sleepy since I started writing tonight. After writing this chapter, I feel like I'm going to heaven. I have to go to bed. Sorry, I'll owe you 10 chapters first. I'll pay you back in 2 days. Sorry. 9 chapters was my limit. I left on the 23rd, recently, I've been in Chengdu, and most of the time, I've been staying in the hotel to write. I'll go home in a few days and settle down. Tomorrow morning's update will probably be late, so I'll update after waking up. Chapter 124. Crassus and Urian looked at Amy, who was clapping her little hands with an expectant look on her face. It was as if they were seeing the little girl from 20 years ago who was clapping her little hands and egging them on to fight, cheering them on as she watched. Irina's affinity with magic was unprecedented. It was as if she had been blessed by magic, and she could learn any type of magic at once. This was why the two of them, who were both among the top magic casters on the continent, wanted to take her as their disciple. With such a disciple, their lives were not in vain. She could learn everything that they knew. Furthermore, she was an elf with a lifespan of 800 years, and the princess of the elven race. In the future, when she used a certain magic spell, perhaps people would remember who her master was, and leave a mark of her own in this world. However, because of the elven queen's intervention, the two of them, who were about to compromise, were unable to take Irina as their disciple. Julian came to Chaos City, and opened a magic potion shop to live a leisurely life. He didn't care much about apprenticeship. In the beginning, he had only taken her as his lifelong rival. Crassus was very eager to take her as his disciple, so he deliberately intervened. He didn't expect that little elven girl to be so eccentric and talented. After spending some time with her, he really wanted to take her as his disciple for the first time. He was completely at odds with Crassus. At the time, Irina was with the two old men, and clearly didn't know how to choose. On one hand, she wanted to learn Crassus's magic caster's staff, and on the other hand, she wanted to learn all of Julian's ice magic. Thus, she didn't take them as her master. In the end, she learned a few spells from each of them, but before she could make a decision, she was taken away by the Elven Queen. This became a regret for both of them. They felt that the other had ruined their plans. Because of this, they fought a few times, but it was a draw. After that, they didn't see each other again. This was their first official meeting since they parted ways more than 10 years ago. The savory tofu pudding is the best. Crassus, since you don't want to admit defeat, do you dare to fight me? Let's see who's better today. Julian stared at the Crassus with a bone-chilling voice. He stole a glance at Amy out of the corner of his eye. The savory tofu pudding was so delicious, so he would definitely like to eat it. As long as he defeated the Crassus and cleared the name of the savory tofu pudding, he might be able to take her as his disciple. The sweet tofu pudding is the best. Crassus's expression also became serious as he glanced at Amy. With Amy's age, she should have a sweet tooth. didn't all children like sweets? As long as he could defeat Julian today, he might be able to accept Amy as his disciple. It seemed that this battle was the most crucial one. He lifted his magic caster's staff and walked out of the door, saying, "If you want to fight, then let's fight. We'll settle old and new grudges together. We haven't seen each other for more than 10 years. I'm afraid you've already forgotten the taste of my magic caster's staff. Hee, look at you now. It's just a walking stick. Do you still think you're the same melee magic caster who could jump up and hit a giant dragon's knee?" Julian pursed his lips with a disdainful expression. He also walked toward the door with a magic staff in his hand. "Hey! Master Julian, please take me with you." Charcoal's fearful voice sounded from behind him. Ugly Duckling was clawing at the birdcage, trying to grab Charcoal with its little paws. However, its paws were simply too small, so it couldn't touch Charcoal at all. Meanwhile, Charcoal was already standing on the other side of the cage. This little guy didn't look very big, but its sharp fangs and claws made Ugly Duckling feel threatened. However, Julian clearly had no intention of paying any attention to him. He and Crassus went straight out the door. "Father, can we go and watch?" Amy looked up at Meg with an expectant expression on her little face. She had never seen magic casters fight before. "Of course you can. Mia, come and watch as well." Meg nodded with a smile. He held on to Amy's little hand and led her toward the door. There was still close to half an hour before opening time, and he was also very curious to see what a battle between 10th tier magic casters would be like. Even Meg Alex didn't have any memories of such a battle. "Oh." Yabamiya also followed along with an expectant expression. The two magic casters were about to fight over whether to eat sweet tofu pudding or salty tofu pudding. As a fan of sweet tofu pudding, she naturally wanted to see Crassus emerge victorious. Ding! The bell rang, and the customers who were lining up at the entrance faltered slightly. They clearly didn't expect the restaurant to open so early. However, when the door opened, it wasn't Meg who came out. Instead, it was Crassus. His expression was a little serious, and the customers lining up at the entrance consciously moved aside to make way for him. Although Crassus often had some interesting interactions with Amy in the restaurant, and also lined up at the entrance early like a normal customer, his status and power as a magic caster of the Roth Empire's royal family still commanded respect. Why did Master Crassus come out of the restaurant so early today? Judging from his expression, he most likely was rejected by Mr. Mac again. Mr. Mac is really a strange man. Exactly. If any magic caster wants my kid, I'll give him 500 gold coins a year. Everyone was discussing softly. They were very envious of Meg. Not only was he good at cooking, but even his cute little daughter was begging a magic caster to take her as his disciple. He was a winner in life. Crassus hadn't gone far when the door rang again. Everyone looked over in surprise. A hunchbacked old man in a black magician's robe slowly walked out of the door. He looked at everyone with a cold gaze. Everyone shifted their gazes. In that instant, everyone felt as if they had fallen into an ice cave. This magician was too frightening. Everyone couldn't help but think of a word, dark magician. Wandering between light and darkness, righteous and evil, dark magicians were existences that were feared by many. If you took a step forward, you would lose your prefix. If you took a step back, you would fall into the abyss and become an evil magic caster. This was what a dark magic caster was. Crassus stood still at the Aiden Square 100 meters away. He turned around and looked at Julian. The blue gem on the top of his magic caster's staff lit up like a torch. Julian walked past the crowd unhurriedly. When he was about 5 meters away from the restaurant, he took a step forward. Countless white frost flowers appeared on the ground under his feet, extending toward Crassus like countless vines. Chapter 125. What a terrifying ice magic spell! At the entrance of the restaurant, someone exclaimed softly. He stared at the square where heavy snow had suddenly fallen. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. That black-robed mage dared to attack Lord Crassus. Lord Crassus is an 8th-tier mage. Is this black-robed mage as powerful as him? But the two of them didn't look too good when they came out of the restaurant. Did they come out of the restaurant to fight? What happened in the restaurant before? Everyone subconsciously took a few steps back in the direction of the restaurant as they whispered in bewilderment. For a moment, they couldn't figure out what had happened to make the two powerful magic casters so angry in the morning, to the point of casting such a terrifying spell. Ding! The bell at the entrance of the restaurant rang again. Meg opened the door, and Amy, who was holding his hand, jumped out first. She looked at the snowy area in front of Julian in the square, and her big blue eyes were full of excitement. She jumped up happily and shook Meg's hand. "Father, look, it's snowing. It's snowing." "Yes, it's snowing, and there's a dragon." Meg nodded, but his attention was more attracted by the frost dragon that was gradually taking shape in the air. It was a silver-white western dragon with a wingspan of more than 20 meters. White scales covered its whole body, and it flapped its wings slowly in the blood mist. The wind and snow would automatically separate when it was about to fall on its body. A pair of big blue eyes opened, and stared at Crassus, who was standing 100 meters away. In Meg Alex's memory, there were many memories of slaying dragons. It wasn't rare to see a sharp heavy sword cut off a dragon's huge head, and the scene of red blood spraying in the air accompanied by the dragon's desperate roar was not uncommon. Hence, he didn't feel afraid when he looked at the dragon. Instead, he felt a little itchy. The hot blood hidden in the depths of his body seemed to suddenly throb after seeing the giant dragon. This hand can only hold a kitchen knife now. I don't know when I'll be able to hold a heavy sword. Meg clenched his fist. Although he wasn't a battle maniac, when he felt that life was boring in his previous life, he had experienced many exciting sports, such as low-altitude parachuting, doing handstands on the Norwegian Giant's tongue, and swinging at 80 kilometers per hour in the Grand Canyon of the United States. If he could go up to the sky and slay a dragon, it would indeed be a good pastime to pass the time. Look, it's a dragon. A frost dragon that's more than 20 meters long. Someone soon noticed the frost dragon in the snow, and exclaimed with some fear on their faces. Even an 8th-tier magus wouldn't be able to summon such a solid frost dragon. This black-robed magus is at least a 9th-tier magus or even a 10th-tier magus. A little old man at the side exclaimed in shock. It seemed that he had some understanding of magi. So that's a dragon. Yabamiya stood behind Mag, and her mouth was also slightly agape at the sight of the frost dragon in the sky. This was the first time she had seen a real giant dragon. Giant dragons would occasionally descend upon Chaos City, but she had spent most of her time in the kitchen of a restaurant, so she had never seen one before. She had only heard about her father from her mother when she was a child. However, that was only a few words that her mother had said to her on a cold night. That was a very imposing man. He wore a suit of golden armor and could transform into a 100-meter-long dragon. He could take her to the heavens and the earth, to wherever she wanted to go. But after saying that, her mother cried the whole night. From then on, she never asked about anything related to the giant dragon again. There's a big flying lizard in the snow. But why can lizards fly? Amy also saw the dragon in the snow, and looked at Meg with confusion. That's a giant dragon, a frost dragon. Meg replied with a smile. Amy had never seen a giant dragon before, but this dragon did look a little like a big lizard with wings. A giant dragon. Amy's eyes lit up. She stood on her short legs and wanted to take a closer look, but there were many customers standing at the restaurant's entrance, blocking her view. She had to turn around and spread her little arms. She pouted and said softly to Meg, "Father, I want a hug. I want to see a giant dragon." Meg looked at Amy, who pouted and raised her little arms, and felt his heart melt. "Forget it. With such a cute daughter, why do I need to go to the sky and slay a giant dragon? Okay, Father will carry you." Meg bent down and picked Amy up with a smile. During this period of time, eating Yangzhou fried rice and Rujiamo had improved his physical fitness. Although it was still some distance away from that of a normal person, it was better than a useless person with 1.5. However, it was still difficult for him to lift her up. The little girl was soft and had a faint fragrance on her body. It was the smell of cherry blossom shower gel. "Father is so nice." Amy hugged Meg's neck with her little arms and leaned over to kiss him on the cheek. Her little face was full of joy. She turned to look at the frost dragon in the sky, and then looked at Crassus standing in the distance. She said worriedly, "If this giant dragon is on Turtle Grandpa's side, will Half-Beard Grandpa be able to defeat it? Father, should we ask them to stop?" "Don't worry. They should be about the same strength." Meg shook his head with a smile. Crassus was the most powerful melee magic caster on the continent, who had killed a giant dragon with his magician's staff. It shouldn't be a problem for him to deal with a frost dragon summoned by magic. After all, they were old rivals. If he couldn't even take the first blow, he didn't deserve to be his opponent at all. However, Amy, who had just instigated Crassus and Julian to fight, was now worried about their safety. Although the little girl liked to be noisy, she was still kind at heart. This made him very happy. "Mr. Mac, what's going on? Why are Lord Crassus and that magic caster fighting?" Prohl asked curiously, turning to Meg when he heard the noise. Hearing that, the customers all turned to look at Meg. Such a big scene was rare in Chaos City. Even the people of the Grey Temple could only maintain order on the sidelines. But they only became like this after they came out of the restaurant. What happened in the restaurant? They were fighting over whether the sweet or salty tofu pudding was better, Amy explained to the crowd. Tofu pudding. The crowd was even more confused. The restaurant didn't sell this dish, right? And if it was a sweet or salty dish, why would they fight over it? Moreover, they were two powerful magic casters. A giant dragon. In the blacksmith's shop next door, a square Mabai pushed open the door and came out. A gust of cold wind blew in his face, making him shiver. He looked up and saw the frost dragon in midair. "I'm currently in 6th place, only a few votes away from 5th place. I'll go out for a Rujiamo tonight, then come back and continue writing. I still have 2 more chapters. I still owe more chapters from tonight. So far, I owe a total of 51 chapters from tips, monthly votes, and average subscriptions. Plus yesterday's 1 chapter, I owe a total of 52 chapters." Chapter 126. Mabai clenched his fists tightly as he looked up at the dragon. His eyes were burning with rage, but he quickly recognized that it was not a real dragon. He looked down and saw Julian, and couldn't help but be surprised. He had been running a blacksmith shop here for decades, and naturally knew that Julian had moved here more than 10 years ago. Moreover, he had bought a lot of middle-grade recovery potions from Julian. After so many years, although they didn't interact much, they still knew each other. Before this, he thought that Julian was at most a 5th-tier magic caster because the effects of his middle-grade recovery potions were ordinary, and the price was cheaper than other places. But now, it seemed that he had completely underestimated Julian's strength. To be able to summon a frost dragon of this level, Julian had to be at least a 9th-tier magic caster. He had no chance of winning against this frost dragon. Seems like I have to hurry up and develop the thunderbolt bomb. Otherwise, I can't even defeat a magic dragon, let alone that damned red dragon. Malbai clenched his fists tightly as he looked in the direction of the restaurant. He glanced at Meg, who was carrying Amy. He didn't know why Julian and Crassus were so angry early in the morning that they were fighting in front of the restaurant. Not far away, Sardras, who was leading two demons with black lava patterns towards the restaurant, suddenly stopped in his tracks and looked in the direction of the restaurant in shock. "Boss, what's wrong?" the tall and thin demon on the left asked Sardras. Sardras continued to stare ahead and asked, "I've told you to be obedient when we reach the restaurant. Do you still remember?" "Boss, didn't you say that it was a restaurant opened by a human?" "So what? Humans have to make a detour when they see us. Once we enter a human's restaurant, we can't do whatever we want and do whatever we want." The short and fat demon next to him laughed foolishly, and didn't seem to take Sardras's words to heart at all. "For you idiot." Sardras knocked the demon's head with a chestnut, and laughed in exasperation. "Look at that for yourself." "What is that?" "The boss's daughter can burn you to ashes with a fireball spell." "Ouch, ouch, ouch." The demon covered his head and jumped 2 steps to the side. He looked in the direction Sardras was pointing, and his eyes widened. He quickly hid behind Sardras, and said with a little fear, "Boss, isn't that the legendary giant dragon? Why is there a dragon here?" "That's right, boss." "Is there a giant dragon behind this restaurant?" the tall and thin troll asked curiously as he inched closer to Sardras. "This is obviously not a real dragon, but even if there isn't a dragon behind this restaurant, there is still a great magician who is even more terrifying than a dragon. So, all of you better behave yourselves, or else I won't be able to save you." Sardras warned seriously as he looked at Crassus, who was standing with a magic caster's staff in the distance. Sardras had been in awe of Crassus ever since he saw Crassus beat a giant dragon with his magic caster's staff outside Los Angeles. He had never seen Meg Alex before, and had only heard about the rumors of Crassus slaying dragons. However, he had seen the power of Crassus with his own eyes. "Is that the white-bearded magic caster?" The 2 demons also looked at Crassus, and then at the giant dragon in the air. "I think that old man will be eaten by that giant dragon, right?" "Not necessarily," Sardras said noncommittally with a smirk. "Look, it's snowing over there. And there's a white giant dragon in there." "Really? Could it be that a giant dragon wants to cause trouble in Chaos City? Isn't that the restaurant that's doing very well recently?" "It's that restaurant with only 2 dishes on the menu, and the cheapest one costs 300 copper coins. I don't know why those idiots are so eager to give money to the owner every day, and even line up early in the morning." "Exactly. It would be great if that giant dragon smashed that restaurant. My restaurant's business has been a lot worse recently, and many of my regulars haven't been coming recently. I saw them lining up in front of that restaurant yesterday. Quick, let's go watch the show. It's a giant dragon. This is the first time I've seen a real giant dragon." Many people in the Aiden Square also noticed the commotion in the corner, and began to talk about it. Many restaurant owners were jealous, and passers-by approached the restaurant curiously. Even in Chaos City, giant dragons were not commonly seen. After all, many giant dragons would transform into human forms after entering Chaos City. "There's a situation over there. It's a battle between 2 magic casters above the 8th tier. It's a 5th tier incident. Report it to the temple immediately. You 2, come with me. Evacuate the crowd and try to minimize the casualties." At the same time, on the other side of the Aiden Square, a middle-aged man in a gray robe looked in the direction of Amy's, and his expression changed. He turned to a young man in a similar gray robe beside him, and rushed toward the restaurant. "Yes," the young man replied. He turned and ran a few steps, and saw a young man in a fancy robe approaching on a horse. He pulled the young man off his horse, and threw a wooden badge into the young man's arms. He flipped onto the horse's back, and said, "The Grey Temple is handling a case, and we're temporarily requisitioning your horse. Come to the Grey Temple with this badge later." "Since when did the Grey Temple take horses for cases?" The young man looked at the wooden badge in his hand with a blank expression. He had wanted to show off his new horse, but now he could only curse his bad luck, and return to the Grey Temple. "The restaurant's new product hasn't been officially released yet. These two happened to have business here, so I let them try it. I didn't expect them to fight over the taste of the new product." At the entrance of the restaurant, Meg looked at the curious customers, and explained with a smile. At a time like this, he naturally had to advertise the tofu pudding. "They're fighting over the taste of a new product?" Everyone's expression became a little strange. It seems that these two flavors must be very unique and delicious. Pearl thought for a moment, and then looked at Meg expectantly, and asked, "Mr. Mack, will the new product be released today?" Chapter 127. Meg shook his head with a smile, and said, "Sorry, we don't have any new products for sale this morning, and the tasting is already over. We'll officially start selling tofu pudding tonight." "I see, then we'll have to come back tonight." Pearl was a little disappointed, but he knew that Meg was a man of his word, so there was no point in trying to persuade him otherwise. All of the other customers also made a mental note of this, and they all prepared to line up early tonight to try this mysterious new product. "Look, Father! The giant dragon is moving." Just as everyone was chatting, Amy suddenly exclaimed excitedly. Julian took 5 steps forward, and the drifting snowflakes had already become a blizzard. The howling winds wreaked havoc within a radius of 100 meters, and a thick layer of snow had already accumulated on the ground. Crassus, who was standing 1,000 feet away, was surrounded by a vast expanse of dryness. All of the wind and snow would automatically part in front of him, as if there were an invisible barrier around him that completely shielded him from the outside world. The staff in his hand was as tall as a man, and a flame seemed to rise from it. The fiery red light looked a little hot, like the warm light in the snowstorm. The frost dragon had already completely materialized, and it flapped its wings, and the blizzard became even more violent. 3 small whirlwinds appeared under its wings, and they quickly grew in size. "Julian, it's been more than 10 years, but it looks like you still haven't made any progress." Crassus looked at the frost dragon in the sky, and was in no hurry to attack. "You're getting older and older," Julian retorted. He waved his wand, and yelled, "Savory tofu pudding is the best. Die, you heretic who eats sweet tofu pudding." The frost dragon in the sky let loose a loud roar, and opened its massive mouth to spit out 3 sharp icicles. 1 turned into 3, 3 turned into 9, and in the blink of an eye, there were 27 half-meter-long icicles, all of which were hurtling toward Crassus like tens of thousands of arrows. "You savory tofu pudding guy, today, I'll show you what's orthodox." Crassus's expression also turned serious. He raised the staff in his hand, and a huge fireball with a diameter of 1 meter appeared. It went straight for the incoming icicles, and exploded in mid-air the moment the two collided. 27 icicles were shattered almost at the same time. Half of them were vaporized, and the rest fell to the ground with a clatter. After listening to their conversation, all the customers finally believed Meg's words. The two of them were really fighting over the taste of tofu pudding. "Wow, Half-Beard Grandpa really knows Fireball, and it looks so powerful. It can even explode." Amy's eyes widened with excitement. "Little me, do you want to learn?" Meg looked at Amy and asked with a smile. Now that the choice was in his hands, he could totally choose what Amy liked. Yes, I do. Amy nodded with anticipation in her eyes. However, her gaze then fell upon the giant dragon in the sky, and she was a little conflicted as she said, "But Turtle Grandpa's giant dragon is also very powerful. If Amy can also conjure a giant dragon, will I be able to sit on it and fly? Then do you want to learn that?" Meg asked, trying not to laugh. In terms of the wonders of magic, Julian's ice magic was indeed more interesting than Crass's simple and crude fireball. Whether it was fun or entertaining, it was definitely more popular among children. Yes, Amy said with a nod after thinking seriously for a while. In that case. Meg fell into deep thought as he looked at the two of them. He didn't think that Amy would want to learn both of them. This was going to be a problem. Meanwhile, Crassus didn't wait for the Frost and Frost Dragon to attack again. Instead, he turned toward Julian with a cold smile, and said, "Even a real giant dragon couldn't stop me, so how can a fake like you be able to stop me? Let's settle our scores today." As soon as his voice trailed off, a series of peculiar silver runes appeared on his legs, and his body swayed as he charged toward Urian. Humph. Julian didn't panic in the slightest. He waved his wand forward, and a series of thick walls of ice appeared in front of Crassus in an attempt to stop him. Bam! A crisp sound rang out, and the first wall of ice shattered under the magic caster's staff. Following that, a series of shattering sounds could be heard. Crassus almost turned into a blur as he charged toward Julian. All the walls of ice in front of him were shattered under the magic caster's staff. From the beginning to the end, the magic caster's staff didn't emit any magic waves. It was held in Crassus' hand as if he was holding a poker. He smashed it all the way, giving people the impression that he was a powerful knight instead of a magic caster. In that case, who's going to win in the end? Someone asked curiously. "I think the black-robed magic caster will win. That's a Frost and Frost Dragon. If he can summon such a terrifying existence, his power must be terrifying. I think Lord Crassus will win. He's a royal worshipper of the Roth Empire. His power shouldn't be underestimated." The moment this question was raised, the guests standing at the door began to argue. "Lord Crassus, you must win. Clear the name of the sweet party." Yabamiya clenched her little fists as she prayed in her heart. Although that Frost and Frost Dragon seemed to be very close to each other, she had no intention of compromising when it came to the taste of tofu pudding. This should be the so-called melee magic caster, right? Meg raised an eyebrow. No matter how glorious the battle records were in the information, it wasn't as shocking as seeing this scene in person. A magic caster with such terrifying speed and power could be said to be a knight who was held back by magic. Wow, Grandpa Halfbeard is so awesome. Father, I want to learn this. Amy exclaimed with her mouth wide open. Julian tilted his head slightly, and heard Amy's words. His expression turned cold, and he pointed his wand at Crassus. The Frost and Frost Dragon in mid-air flapped its wings, and flew straight down. Its sinister dragon head opened its mouth, and bit down at Crassus. "That bite is going to kill someone," someone exclaimed softly. Some timid people had already closed their eyes, and didn't dare to continue watching. Chapter 128. The fact that a great magician was able to break through the ice with his staff had already shocked everyone. Now, he was even able to jump 3 meters in a single leap. It looked like he was going to smash the dragon's head with his staff. This move completely overturned everyone's impression of mages being weak in close combat and relying only on their mouths. This old man was simply an unprecedented close combat mage. Against the terrifying Frost Wyrm, he had only cast the most basic fireball spell from beginning to end, and relied on the magic caster's staff for the rest. Gandalf. Meg raised his eyebrows. Julian's ice magic was superb, while Crassus's magic and melee combat abilities were perfectly integrated. All kinds of magic runes appeared on his body to support him in completing various difficult moves, and at the same time, provide him with great strength. Both of them had their own strengths in magic. If Amy could learn ice magic from Julian and melee magic from Crassus, she might be able to grow into a magician who could attack from afar and improve. Such a magician had almost no weaknesses, and it was probably unprecedented. I just don't know if they will agree. After all, they seem to want to fight to the death when they see each other. Meg looked at the two of them a little worriedly. Now that he had everything planned out, the next step was to see how he could make the two of them agree to accept Amy as their disciple. Amazing, amazing. Father, I want to learn all of them. Amy clapped her little hands and exclaimed excitedly, "It's so fun to smash the ice with a staff. It's so fun to transform into a dragon. It can even snow. Then, we can build a big snowman in front of the restaurant every day. Okay, then let's make your request later. Maybe they will agree." Meg looked at Amy in his arms, and his eyes lit up. If he were to say this, it would seem a little greedy, but if Amy were to say it, then there would be no problem. Okay. Amy nodded obediently. After thinking for a while, she said, "But don't they all want to accept Amy as their disciple? You should be more anxious than them, right?" "Yes, that's probably the case." Meg was taken aback for a moment. That was indeed the case, but he did not expect Amy to be able to see the situation so clearly. She was even a little scheming. Everyone held their breaths as they stared at the Crassus that had leaped high into the air. The magic staff that was as tall as a human was flashing with a red light, and mysterious golden-red runes appeared on it, enveloping the entire staff as if it had been ignited. On the other side, a frost wyrm with a wingspan of more than 20 meters swooped down with a snowstorm. The strong winds it brought along created a huge crater in the snow on the ground. The three tornadoes formed earlier flew towards the Crassus in a triangular formation. Two small trees were swept up and cut into pieces by the tornadoes. Even a rock was cut into pieces. The howling snowstorm drifted out, bringing with it the coldness of winter. When it landed on the faces of the onlookers, it was a little painful. The onlookers were a little frightened and took a few steps back. Watching a fight of this level would be life-threatening. White light flashed in the dragon's open mouth, and a silvery white ball of light condensed as if it were preparing for some kind of powerful attack. Can the Crassus defeat this dragon? Everyone was speculating in their hearts. Compared to the massive dragon, the Crassus was like an ant trying to compete with an elephant. There was no comparison in terms of size. The Great Temple is handling this case. Those who are not involved in this matter, step back. Right at this moment, a loud voice sounded from behind everyone, and everyone hurriedly opened up a path. Bazir came forward with two members of the Great Temple. His chest was heaving up and down violently from running all the way. He looked at the terrifying dragon and the Crassus, who had leaped high into the air and was about to smash the dragon's head with his staff, and his expression darkened. As the captain of the patrol team of the Great Temple and a fifth-tier knight, he was naturally not weak. He was able to handle most of the things that happened in the Aiden Square every day. However, looking at the frost dragon and the white-haired old man leaping high into the air with his staff, he was getting a headache. Unfortunately for him, this was the situation that he was unable to resolve. This was a duel between two magicians above the 9th level. Let alone him, even if it was a knight of the 8th level, he would only be able to say a few words. He didn't even have the qualifications to do so. He turned his head to the two men beside him and said, "Evacuate the crowd and minimize the casualties. Wait for backup." "Yes." The two subordinates also wore grave expressions. They had been patrolling the Aden Square for a while, and they had seen many small fights every day. However, a duel between two great magic casters like this was very rare. They quickly rushed out and gestured for the onlookers to back off in case they were accidentally injured. More and more people were attracted by the commotion. A gigantic frost dragon and a snowstorm that had appeared in this area were extremely rare scenes. Under the watchful eyes of the onlookers, Crassus' staff finally landed on the frost dragon's head. The frost dragon opened its mouth and spat out a silver ball of ice. The light snowflakes floating in the air instantly froze into ice particles before falling to the ground. A terrifyingly low temperature emanated from the ball of ice, and it seemed as if something was struggling to break out of the ball of ice. Break! Crassus roared as his hand landed on the ball of ice first. Bam! A crisp sound rang out, and the head-sized ball of ice instantly shattered. An even smaller silver ice dragon darted out of the ball of ice, trying to go around the staff and crash into Crassus. However, the speed of the staff was simply too fast. The moment the ball of ice shattered, it had already landed on the small silver dragon and smashed it into nothingness. The chill in the air was dispelled by the flames circulating on the staff. The snowflakes in the air were also swept away, and a clear space appeared in mid-air. There was nothing in front of the frost dragon's head, and the staff landed on the frost dragon's head without slowing down. Bam! A muffled sound rang out. The staff, which was as tall as a man, was like a matchstick in front of the frost dragon with a wingspan of 20 meters. It looked a little ridiculous. However, when this matchstick-like object landed on the frost dragon's head, it was as if it had the force of 1,000 kilograms. The frost dragon's head that had been raised high up in the air was suddenly smashed off. A beam of fire rose from the staff, and instantly enveloped the frost dragon's head. The red flames spread along the dragon's body, and in the blink of an eye, the white frost dragon had turned into a fire dragon. With a bang, it exploded, and turned into a dense mist that filled the air. Chapter 129. I can't believe he won. The crowd was silent for a moment as they looked on at the giant dragon that Crassus had smashed into smithereens. In comparison, Crassus was so tiny, yet he was able to smash a frost dragon into smithereens. Everyone was struck by a sense of absurdity. Wow, Half-Beard Grandpa is so awesome. That's awesome. Amy's eyes also widened as she clapped her little hands together. She looked at the staff in Crassus' hand with sparkling blue eyes, and exclaimed, "That staff is so powerful. If only I could hold it." Meg was also quite surprised. The power displayed by Crassus was indeed incredible. It was hard to believe that a 120-years-old man could achieve such a feat. This wasn't just pure physical strength. Instead, it was the perfect application of magic to his body. His control over the giant dragon was truly astounding. That old man is so scary. The two lava demons behind Sargeras were completely astonished. They had thought that the giant dragon was already terrifying enough, but they didn't think that the old man would be able to smash it into smithereens with a single strike. This was the first time that they'd learned that humans, who were synonymous with weakness in their hearts, could be so powerful and terrifying. Half of that old man's beard was burned off by the restaurant owner's daughter. Sargeras had seen Crassus smashing a real giant dragon into smithereens outside of Rhodu, so he had some inkling of what was to come, and wasn't very surprised. That little girl is so terrifying. The tall and thin demon exclaimed. He hesitated momentarily before tugging on Sargeras' sleeve, and fearfully said, "Boss, why don't we go to another restaurant? Keel and I just arrived in Chaos City today, so we can just find a random restaurant to eat at." "That's right, boss. We haven't seen each other for decades. This time, we rushed over as soon as we heard about you." Many of our brothers are still on the way. Mond and I were discussing on the way to have a good drink with you, boss. I'm afraid drinking in that restaurant won't be fun. The short and fat demon nodded in agreement. Sargeras shook his head, and didn't explain further. There's no wine in this restaurant, and I didn't come here to welcome you. I brought you here to try the Ruggiemo. After tasting it, you'll know why I summoned you to Chaos City. Sargeras shook his head, and didn't explain much. The two demons looked at each other to make sure that Sargeras had no intention of changing his mind, so they didn't say anything else. Sargeras was the most powerful lava warrior among the lava demons. He had led the lava demons into countless battles with other demon races. But 50 years ago, he chose to leave the demon islands, saying that he wanted to find a way for the lava demons to break through and reignite the glory of the lava demons. 50 years had passed in the blink of an eye, and there had been no news of him. A few days ago, he suddenly sent a message back to the lava demons via Flamingo, saying that he had found a way to make the lava demons break through quickly. He wanted to gather his brothers in Chaos City. The lava demons hadn't been doing well in recent years. Many of them were wandering outside, so only the two of them could come here as soon as possible. Many others might be on the way. The name Sargeras represented the hope of the lava demons. Not long ago, they thought that he had died in a foreign land. Otherwise, why hadn't there been any news from him for so long? When the chief received the message, he even suspected that it was a trap set by other demon races. When the two of them came to Chaos City and found Sargeras according to the address, although they hadn't seen each other for 50 years, the feeling of meeting their leader made their blood boil again. The lava demons wouldn't be bullied by other demon races anymore. You're a third slower than you used to be. Looks like you're really getting old, Julian said as he looked at Crassus with deep eyes. No, I'm dying. If you still want to fight with me this time, I'll fight with my life. Crassus slowly tightened his grip on his magic caster's staff. Raging flames rose from the staff and enveloped his body. Standing in the snow, he was very eye-catching. Julian frowned. This time, he was silent for a long time. In a hoarse voice, he said, "Most of the people who experienced that war back then are dead. I didn't expect that our sworn enemies would survive to the end. Everyone will die. The two of us have already lived for many more years." Crassus' expression softened a little. He looked at Julian, who was also old and hunched like he was carrying a big turtle shell. Those people back then had died one by one, and there weren't many left. Yes. You're going to die anyway, so I don't mind you dying early. Julian nodded, and a sinister smile appeared on his face. He waved the black magic staff in his hand, and sharp icicles suddenly rose from Crassus' feet. They grew rapidly, and pierced towards Crassus, who was standing in the middle like a bird's nest. Everyone's heart skipped a beat when they saw this scene. Julian's move was no different from a sneak attack. It would not be easy for Crassus to dodge it all of a sudden. "You're about the same as me." Crassus also smiled. He slammed his magic caster's staff on the ground, and the flames around his body surged out, forming a wall of fire around him. All the icicles cracked and broke when they hit the wall of fire. They turned into water vapor and completely evaporated. The seemingly dangerous scene was resolved just like that. Crassus moved his feet, and rushed towards Julian, who was not far away. He smashed all the icicles that appeared along the way, and none of them could stop him at all. Bang! Crassus appeared in front of Julian almost in the blink of an eye. He smashed his magic caster's staff on Julian's head without hesitation, but there was a crisp sound, and he turned into ice shards on the ground. It was an iceman. "Crassus, I'm here." Julian's voice came from behind. Countless Julians appeared in the square, and all of them looked exactly the same. They all had sinister smiles on their faces as they stared at Crassus. There are so many turtle shell grandpas. Which one is the real him? Amy looked around curiously, trying to find the real Julian among them. However, all of them looked exactly the same, and there was no way to tell them apart. Julian, you still like to hide as much as you did in the past. As a great mage, is this all you've got? Crassus frowned as he saw an exaggerated number of Julians. Crassus, you've led the mages astray. Do you know how many talented mages were cut down like vegetables by those ordinary knights when they wanted to learn how to fight at close range like you? As a noble mage, you should play with the enemy. Only those clumsy knights like to fight at close range. Julian's annoyed voice sounded. At the same time, he raised his hand and was about to attack. Chapter 130. Without Urian's control, the howling snowstorm swept in all directions, with Mamie Restaurant, which was the closest to the restaurant. Snowflakes struck the faces of the onlookers, and it was a little painful. Snowflakes made a rustling sound as if they were going to shatter the glass, and everyone retreated in a disheveled manner in an attempt to find shelter from the snowstorm. Amy's eyes narrowed slightly as she yelled in a huff. A few snowflakes had landed on her little face, and she glanced sideways at a snowflake that had landed on the corner of her lips. After a moment of hesitation, she stuck out her little tongue to lick it, and her eyes immediately lit up. It's cold and delicious. Upon hearing Amy's voice, Crassus and Julian stopped in their tracks at the same time. The violent snowstorm abruptly subsided, and the flames on Crassus' body also subsided significantly. Today's battle had started because they wanted to take Amy as their disciple. Although they had completely exploded because of the tofu pudding taste, in the end, they still wanted to take Amy as their disciple. Both of them were well aware of this, so gaining Amy's favor was more important than anything else. The two of them were evenly matched in strength, so they naturally had to put their hearts and minds into the fight. Therefore, their ability to control the field was naturally reduced by a lot. No one could guarantee that they wouldn't hurt the onlookers in such a situation. Who knew if a fireball accidentally went off course and smashed into the restaurant? That would be really bad. The two of them looked at each other with wariness in their eyes, and neither of them had any intention of continuing the battle. There were simply too many onlookers. Although it was still early in the morning, the Aiden Square was bustling with people all day long. At this moment, there were already hundreds of people gathered around the restaurant, all of them standing on their tiptoes and craning their necks to see what was going on. Upon hearing that it was a battle between great magic casters, they thought that it would be fine if there were more people, so they squeezed forward as if their lives depended on it. The two of them didn't hold back in the slightest, and if they were the slightest bit careless and threw a spell off course, then a large number of people would die. In Chaos City, death was no small matter. Even though they were both 10th-tier magic casters, not many people could kill them. However, it was clearly unrealistic for them to continue teaching Amy magic here. And judging from Amy's angry expression, it seemed that she was really angry. If neither of them were willing to take him as their master, then the loss would outweigh the gain. Sweet tofu pudding is the best. Crassus hesitated for a moment before withdrawing his staff. He looked at Amy and said, "Amy, don't you think so? Savory tofu pudding is the real delicacy." Urian's hoarse voice also sounded, and a series of cracking sounds rang out as half of the ice shattered, and ice shards fell all over the ground. The customers surrounding the restaurant's entrance parted to the sides, and even the people who came to watch the fun looked at Amy. They originally expected the two great magicians to fight until the sky darkened and the earth darkened. They didn't expect that halfway through the fight, they would stop because of a little girl's words. They all looked at Amy with some curiosity, trying to guess her identity. I think both of them are delicious. The savory tofu pudding can be eaten with rugiamo. It's salty and delicious, and the sweet tofu pudding is especially delicious after a meal. Why are you fighting over it? Amy looked at the two of them with a perplexed expression on her little face. You like both of them. Crassus and Julian had prepared to refute each other's words, but they swallowed them back. They looked at Amy, and didn't know what to say for a moment. These two great magicians are actually fighting over the taste of a dish in this restaurant. The onlookers were all surprised to hear this, and their eyes immediately lit up as they looked at Amy's. In terms of appearance, this restaurant was definitely the most beautiful in the Eden Square. They had no idea when such a beautiful restaurant had opened in this corner of the Eden Square. Moreover, to be able to make two great mages fight over a dish, it also made everyone curious. What kind of dish could provoke such a dispute? A small restaurant couldn't afford to hire two great mages to advertise, let alone to make such a big fuss. What was even more surprising was that the two of them, who seemed to be at loggerheads with each other, actually stopped their quarrel because of Amy's words. They seemed to care a lot about the half-elf girl's opinion, which made them even more confused. They stopped. Basil was also taken aback. He had been prepared for this corner of the Eden Square to be completely destroyed, and this incident could escalate to a 6-1. He didn't expect the fight to stop just like that, and he and the other two members of the Grey Temple didn't know what to do. Amy looked at the two of them, and nodded earnestly. Yes, Father's tofu pudding is super delicious. I love both the savory and the sweet ones. Amy nodded. She clenched her little fists and said, also, next time you fight, you have to go further away. Don't fight in the restaurant, or I'll get angry. If I get angry, I'll burn you with a fireball. Half-beard Grandpa, if you don't want the other half of your beard to be burned, you have to be careful. Otherwise, I'll have to call you Beardless Grandpa from now on. Crassus reflexively put a hand over his beard. He had been growing and maintaining it for 30 years, and he had always treasured it. He didn't think that half of it would be burned by Amy's fireball a few days ago, and now that she was threatening to burn the other half, he was naturally a little nervous. However, he still forced a smile onto his face as he looked at Amy, and said, Little Amy, did you see how I destroyed that frost dragon with my staff? That's true magic. It combines the magic system with the body to construct a brand new magic system. If you learn my magic, you'll be able to do the same. You'll be far more powerful and difficult to deal with than a knight. Someone like you won't even be able to fly. Julian curled his lips and looked at Amy. He said with some temptation, Little girl, if you learn my magic, you'll be able to summon a frost dragon like that one sooner or later. You'll also be able to control an area to make it snow. You'll also be able to have countless clones that look exactly the same. It'll be super fun. Everyone's eyes widened when they saw this scene. They originally thought that these two would be arrogant masters, but they didn't expect that they would stop fighting just because of Amy's words. Now, they even started to promote themselves. This situation made everyone a little confused for a moment. Powerful melee magic and ice magic that can summon a frost dragon. This choice is really a bit of a headache. Everyone looked at Julian and Crassus. They had seen the battle between the two before, and although there was no clear winner, their strength was deeply ingrained in everyone's hearts. It was like two dishes with different styles, but both were exceptionally delicious. If they had to choose, they would also have a headache. Chapter 131. This was probably the answer that everyone had thought of, but no one dared to say it out loud. They were two great magicians above the 9th tier, and one was a royal magician, while the other was a mysterious dark magician. Judging from their previous exchange, it was not an exaggeration to say that they were like fire and water. Who would have thought that Amy would want to learn both magicians without much thought? Crassus and Julian were also taken aback, but surprisingly, neither of them was in a hurry to refute or reject her. They looked at each other with complicated expressions. 20 years ago, the elven girl clapped her hands and said the same thing. After that, the two of them fought for almost a year, but neither of them was convinced. Before they could determine a winner, the elven girl was taken away. Although neither of them said anything about it afterward, it was undeniable that this was probably one of the things that they regretted the most. Because neither of them was the master, they did not even have the right to stand up and stop the two of them. I think this is great. I can learn the flying magic from Half-Beard Grandpa, and I can also learn the magic from Turtleshell Grandpa, which can make dragons appear. I'm sure I'll be super powerful in the future. Amy clapped her hands, and said with a happy smile on her face. Actually, I think you only need to learn one of my magicians. As long as you can learn my magic, you'll be able to knock the head of a dragon at will. There's no need for any extra magic. You only need to learn the fireball spell. You can smash a dragon like that down from the sky with a single fireball spell. Crassus tried to persuade her. It's not nice for a girl to fly around with a big stick. If you learn my magic, it'll be fine even if you wear a skirt. They won't even be able to touch the corner of your clothes. How elegant. That's what a girl should look like. Julian also tried to soften his voice as much as possible. Meg's lips curled up slightly. He could see the possibility of a compromise from Julian and Crassus' faces. Sure enough, it was best for Amy to bring this up herself. Moreover, both of them really did want to take Amy as their disciple. If Amy could mediate the conflict between them, it would be a good thing. After all, at her age, she probably did not have many old friends in this world. I want to learn both of your magicians. Please. Amy shook her head, and looked at the two of them pitifully with her big, watery eyes. Crassus and Julian looked at Amy, and suddenly felt their hearts soften. It was as if they had seen that little elven girl who usually had a sharp tongue, but when she acted coy. It was just that Amy was a bit younger, and she had a venomous tongue as well. She couldn't even bring herself to reject her when she looked at her like that, so she just nodded her head. Is that so? Grandpa Turtleshell, Grandpa Halfbeard, are you really going to teach me magic together? Amy's eyes suddenly lit up. She hugged Meg and kissed him on the cheek. She said happily, Father, Amy has two masters now. Masters who can teach Amy magic. Crassus came back to his senses and nodded. He opened his mouth to say something. Hello, Master Halfbeard. Amy turned around and called out to Crassus in a crisp voice. Crassus was stunned for a moment. When he saw the smile on Amy's face, he swallowed the rest of his words. The corners of his mouth twitched, but he still managed to squeeze out a smile. He nodded and replied, Okay. But... Julian raised his eyebrows. Hello, Master Turtleshell. Amy also turned to look at Julian. After thinking for a moment, she said with a smile, In that case, can I play with green bean and charcoal every day? Julian looked at the smiling Amy with a conflicted expression on his face. In the end, he nodded, and said in a hoarse voice, Yes, you can. That's great. I'm so happy. Amy clapped her little hands. Little stars appeared in her eyes. She was full of longing and anticipation. If she learned from Grandpa Halfbeard's magic, she would be able to fly. If she learned from Grandpa Turtleshell's magic, she would be able to make it snow and summon a giant dragon. So, does that mean they've agreed? The onlookers didn't dare to make a sound from the beginning to the end. They didn't expect that the two great magicians who were fighting in full swing would become the master of the same little girl in the blink of an eye. Moreover, it was a little half-elf girl who seemed to be the daughter of the restaurant's owner. Mr. Mack, what do you think of this matter? Crassus turned to look at Meg, who hadn't said a word. In this matter, Meg played a decisive role. I respect Amy's choice. I can't deny that both of you are powerful magic casters. However, I hope that both of you can fulfill the promise you made in the restaurant. This is my only condition. Meg looked at the two of them with a serious expression. The only condition he had was actually a lot of demands. Sly old fox. Julian and Crassus looked at Meg, and these words flashed through their minds at the same time. That was the condition they had proposed when they were competing with each other. Now that both of them had agreed to take in disciples at the same time, Meg actually wanted them to follow the same condition. He was simply displaying his businessman nature to the extreme. However, judging from Meg's expression, there was no room for negotiation. With a talented and adorable daughter, he could really do whatever he wanted. Although I hate that my disciple has another master, I respect her choice. It's a pity that she has bad taste. From tomorrow onwards, she will learn from you for 3 days, and from me for 3 days, and rest for 1 day. I've agreed to all the conditions you proposed. Julian raised his hand, and the rest of the ice statues were all shattered. He slowly walked out from the corner, and looked at Julian coldly. Also, tofu pudding is the best when it's salty. If Amy didn't want to learn your fancy tricks, do you think I'd be willing to take in the same disciple as you? 3 days is fine. The time will be according to the restaurant's break time. I've also agreed to all the conditions you proposed. Crassus also extinguished the fire on his magician's staff. He pointed his staff at Julian and said seriously, "Tofu pudding is the best when it's sweet. If you don't like it, come and fight me at any time." Meg put Amy on the ground with a smile. He glanced at the clock in the restaurant, and nodded at the two. "Okay. In that case, Amy's class will start tomorrow. The restaurant is open for business. If you two want to eat, you can have breakfast before you leave. 2 plates of Yangzhou fried rice. Oh, and a Rugiamo today." Crassus walked into the restaurant first. "1 for each," Julian said as he looked at Crassus' back and thought for a while. He also walked into the restaurant. "Captain, what should we do now?" A member of the Grey Temple whispered to Baser. Because the battle was short, the square was not badly damaged, and there were no casualties. Only 2 small trees were damaged in the battle. The destruction was not as destructive as the battle between the 2 orcs 2 days ago. Chapter 132. Meg took a glance at Baser before quickly averting his gaze. He turned to the customer standing at the entrance of the restaurant with a smile, and said, "Sorry for the fright, everyone. The restaurant is already open for business, please come in." It was normal for people from the Grey Temple to come. After all, they were in charge of maintaining order in Chaos City, and it was inevitable that they would have to deal with them after opening the restaurant. However, Meg didn't want them to pay too much attention to him. After all, they were such a powerful force. If they investigated seriously, they might find out something he didn't want them to know, such as his relationship with Meg Alex. Of course, even if Meg Alex's closest friends and family were standing right in front of him, they would still find it very difficult to believe that the great general who could slay dragons with a heavy sword had now become a chef who could cook one delicacy after another with a kitchen knife. "Mr. Mac, you're awesome." Prohl gave Mag a thumbs up and walked in with admiration. He had been scared out of his wits when he saw the battle just now, but Mag, the one who had started it, could negotiate with 2 great magic casters calmly. He didn't back down at all. Both of them were selling themselves, but the difference between them was obvious. Meg sighed in his heart. What could he do? It was different from his previous life. If Julian could pay for Amy's meals, it would be a lot of money. He was in a hurry to save up for strength points. Money was really important. With money, one could really do anything. At least, that was the case for the system. By the way, system, each strength point will cost 10,000 gold coins, right? Meg suddenly asked curiously in his heart. The price of the next strength point will be announced after the first strength point is purchased, the system's voice sounded. System, you're not trying to cheat me, are you? Meg narrowed his eyes. He felt that there was more to the system's words. It seemed that it wanted to raise the price again. System, please complete the mission as soon as possible and upgrade the restaurant. After upgrading the restaurant, you'll have a higher chance of receiving strength points as a reward. The system avoided Mag's question, and fell completely silent after that. You win. Meg sighed in his heart. The system was willing to do anything to upgrade the restaurant. It cost 50,000 gold coins to upgrade the restaurant to level 2, which was 5 million copper coins. The restaurant's turnover yesterday was the highest in history. It sold 500 rugiamos and 100 plates of Yangzhou fried rice. After deducting the cost of ingredients, the profit was 1,400 gold coins. It would take at least a month to save enough money. Fortunately, this upgrade cost 50,000 gold coins in addition to the cost of food, and not 50,000 gold coins directly. Hence, the cost of purchasing physique points should also be included. Meg glanced at the task of 1,000 customers. The progress bar showed that the number of rugiamos sold yesterday had increased a lot, and the restaurant was becoming more and more famous because of the word of mouth. More and more customers were coming to the restaurant, and they were contributing to the increase in the number of customers. This restaurant looks good. There are so many people waiting in line for a meal so early in the morning, and 2 great magic casters are fighting over the taste of the dishes. It seems worth a try, a young man in a tight suit said to himself as he walked towards the restaurant. It's rare to come to this corner of the Aden Square. I didn't expect to see a restaurant here. Let's try it. A middle-aged woman in a fancy dress looked up and down at the restaurant, and then followed the young man into the restaurant. Many onlookers chose to follow Crassus and Julian into the restaurant after the show ended. They were curious about what this restaurant, which had appeared quietly in this corner of the Aden Square, sold. I'm so angry. This fellow has lured the customers away again. Those 2 fellows didn't even pay for my 2 bowls of noodles, and they even took my bowls away. At the entrance of a certain noodle shop, the lady boss stood with her hands on her hips as she glared in the direction of Mamie Restaurant. Who the hell is this owner? I can't believe he can think of such a way to attract customers. 2 great magic casters. How enviable. A fat owner stood in front of the bun shop, looking around enviously. The restaurant opened early in the morning, and only 3 buns had been sold. Basil, what's the situation now? Not long after, an old man with gray-white hair rode over on a horse. He glanced at the snow-covered area, dismounted, and asked Basil. Brandley, you're here. Basil hurried over and took the reins. This old man was a respected 7th-tier magic caster from the Grey Temple. He lowered his voice and said, "The battle is over. The damage to the square was limited, and there were no casualties. The 2 sides have reached a truce, and now they're in this restaurant for breakfast." So soon. Brandley was a little surprised. He had just received news of a 5th-tier incident, and he had immediately come here on the horse of the guard who had delivered the news. He was worried that Basil wouldn't be able to control the situation. The residual magic waves left behind at the scene were quite alarming to him. The snow was over 20 centimeters deep, the ground was littered with ice shards, and the ground had been crushed into a deep crater. The 3 tornadoes had left behind such damage in such a short time, and it was quite clear that the 2 magic casters involved in the conflict were far more powerful than he was. Who were they? Brandley asked with a hint of fear in his eyes. 2 old men. One of them is wearing a white robe and a short beard, and he's wielding a magic staff. What's strange is that he doesn't use magic to attack from afar. Instead, he chooses to engage in melee combat. The other one is wearing a black robe, and he's an ice magic caster. He summoned a frost dragon. Basil quickly recounted what had happened. The one in the white robe is Master Crassus. I heard that he came to Chaos City a few days ago, but I didn't think that he would get into a conflict here today. Branley was a little surprised. His brows furrowed as he mused. Master Crassus ranks among the top 3 in the Magus Tower, yet that black-robed magic caster is able to hold his own against him. Black robe, ice magic, hunchback, could it be? Branley's eyes widened as he looked into the restaurant nervously. What's wrong? Basil turned to Branley with a perplexed expression. Seeing as there are no casualties, we don't have to worry about this. Tell them not to send reinforcements. Don't clean up the plaza, and stay away from this corner today. Branley shook his head, and didn't explain any further. All right. Basil was a little confused, but he didn't ask any questions. He could tell from Branley's expression that this wasn't something that they could intervene in. He gave some instructions to the 2 guards beside him, and stood off to the side in silence. Could it really be the Lord of Ice, Julian? I didn't think that the 2 legendary magic casters would meet again. I wonder who will emerge victorious in this clash of ice and fire, Branley thought to himself, and his heart was suddenly filled with excitement. Chapter 133. Even though Branley was now a senior in the eyes of many of the younger magic casters, the battle between Crassus and Julian had been the most exciting thing to the magic casters of the Norland continent when they were young. It was a duel between long-range and melee attacks. Should a mage be a melee or a long-range attacker? Because of this, there were 2 completely different factions. Every duel between the 2 of them attracted a lot of attention. Unfortunately, Julian suddenly disappeared 20 years ago, and the battle between fire and ice that had lasted for close to 100 years was cut short. It had become one of the greatest regrets of the older magic casters. However, according to Basil's description, Branley was almost certain that the battle between fire and ice had reappeared after 20 years. He just didn't think that it would take place in Chaos City, and that the battle would only last for such a short time. Of course, what was even more surprising to him was that the 2 of them had gone to the same restaurant for breakfast after the battle. Branley hesitated momentarily before turning to Basil, and asking, why did they start fighting? From what I've heard, it seems to be because of the taste of a mysterious dish called tofu pudding. A peculiar expression appeared on Basil's face. He paused momentarily before adding, in the end, they both took in the daughter of the owner of this restaurant as their disciple. How is that possible? Branley exclaimed, but quickly realized that he had lost his composure. He shook his head with disbelief and said, impossible. How could the Lord of Ice and the Lord of Fire have the same disciple? If you're sure that those 2 are the ones you're talking about, then that is indeed the case. Basil didn't understand why Branley was so agitated all of a sudden, but he still nodded. Branley quickly calmed down, and said to Basil, you can leave now. If it really is those 2, then even the Lord of the Norland Palace has to treat them as equals. We can't afford to mess with them. Get someone to come and fix the square tomorrow. Don't let this matter spread. All right. Basil nodded, and waved a hand, and his 2 subordinates quickly left. Branley looked in the direction of the restaurant, and hesitated momentarily before adjusting his magician's robe. Like a little girl who was going to meet her idol, he walked toward the entrance of the restaurant with a hint of nervousness and anticipation. The door of the restaurant was pushed open, and the bell hanging on the door made a crisp sound. The restaurant was almost full. His gaze passed through the crowd and finally landed on the 2 innermost tables near the counter. There were 2 people sitting with their backs facing the door. One of them had a short white beard and was wearing a white mage robe, while the other had a hunchback and was wearing a black mage robe. The people around them didn't sit at those two tables. Those two should be ice and fire, right? Branley stopped in his tracks and looked at the two figures from behind with tears welling up in his eyes. These two people almost represented an era of magic. Who would have thought that they would be able to sit together and have breakfast, even if they were not at the same table? If this news were to spread, many mages of their generation would probably find it hard to believe. Looks like this is the little half-elf girl. Branley's gaze fell on Amy as he thought to himself. He pulled out a chair and sat down before opening the menu and randomly ordering a dish. "Miss Mia, I'm here again." Sargeras gently pushed open the door of the restaurant with Keel and Mond, and looked at Yabamiya with a bashful smile. "Welcome," Yabamiya nodded with a smile, and looked at Sargeras. "Do you still want Rugiamo?" This demon had left a deep impression on her during the past 2 days. Although his big bald head and lava patterns were a little frightening, he had a good personality. He always had a smile on his face, and he only ate Rugiamo. "Yes, I want 5 more Rugiamos, and 3 for each of them." Sargeras nodded with a bashful smile. "Okay, please wait a moment." Yabamiya nodded and walked to the kitchen. The restaurant was almost full now, and only the table by the door was empty. It was Sargeras' favorite seat. "This half-dragon girl's smile is so beautiful," Keel said with a smile. It was the first time he had seen such a pure smile. "Yes, she's beautiful, too. Much prettier than the women in our tribe." Mon nodded. He pulled out a chair and was about to sit down when he looked at the iron chair in Sargeras' hand. "Boss, aren't there chairs in the restaurant? Why did you bring a chair?" "You'll know in a while. Remember, when the dishes are served, you two have to stand while eating. If you break anything in the restaurant, you two won't be able to pay for it." Sargeras smiled mysteriously, and warned them seriously at the same time. "Okay." Keel and Mon didn't know why, but since Sargeras said so, they did as they were told. After all, they had been like this for many years. The customers nearby watched the 3 demons sit down. Those who came here for the first time were a little nervous and wanted to squeeze to the side, but the regulars were already used to it. This demon came to the restaurant at least twice a day, and each time he sat at the door. After eating, he would emit flames all over his body, which was very impressive. But other than that, he had always behaved himself and never had any conflicts with anyone. "Big Baldy, keep your voice down in the restaurant, okay?" Just then, a soft voice came from the direction of the counter. The restaurant quieted down immediately, and many people looked at Sargeras. Even Crassus and Julian looked over. Where did this little, Keel's thick eyebrows furrowed, and he was about to stand up. "Shut up." Sargeras covered his mouth with his big hand. He smiled at Amy, who was sitting at the counter, and said, "Okay, I'll be careful." Amy was holding Ugly Duckling in her arms. Her eyes lit up when she saw Sargeras and the other 2 demons at the door. "Did Big Baldy bring Baldy 2 and Baldy 3 here?" "I don't mind if you call them that." Sargeras nodded with a smile. "Okay, then I'll call them that." Amy nodded happily. The 3 big bald heads were like 3 big lanterns. Sargeras let go of Keel's hand. He looked at Keel, who was about to say something, and said in a low voice, "If you think your head is harder than that dragon's, you can say everything you want to say." Keel's eyes widened, and he immediately swallowed the rest of his words. He secretly looked back at Amy, who was happily playing with a cat and a bird behind the counter. "Boss, is that the restaurant owner's daughter you were talking about?" he whispered. "Yes, she should be that magic caster's disciple now." Sargeras nodded. Even he didn't dare to mess with that girl. "I can't mess with her." Mon swallowed. If that girl was really that magic caster's disciple, messing with her would be suicide. Chapter 134. Julian looked at the Yangzhou fried rice in front of him and frowned. He looked hesitant. He couldn't remember how long it had been since he last ate meat. 30 years. Or 50 years. Or was it when he was 20 years old and saw a group of ogres eating an entire village of villagers? Although those disgusting fellows were frozen into ice by him in the end, many years later, he still killed his way to the ogre tribe on Demon Island and almost exterminated the entire ogre tribe. But that scene was still replaying in his mind even after 100 years. He still felt uncomfortable when he saw meat. But strangely, when he saw the ham in the Yangzhou fried rice today, he didn't feel uncomfortable at all. The aroma of eggs mixed with the smell of other ingredients made him feel restless. One had to know that he usually ate plain boiled vegetables. Occasionally, he would boil an egg, which was already considered a meat dish. He couldn't bear to see a trace of meat or fish. Facing such a plate of oily eggs mixed with all kinds of messy ingredients, he actually had the idea of eating it, which made him feel a little incredulous. He followed Crassus into the restaurant because he didn't want to be close to Amy before Crassus could. "Do you want to try it?" Julian hesitated. "Boss." Another plate of Yangzhou fried rice. "Your Yangzhou fried rice is so delicious." A young man sitting next to him put down his spoon. He had already finished his plate of Yangzhou fried rice, and his face was full of satisfaction. "Okay, please wait a moment," Yabamiya replied with a smile and turned to enter the kitchen. "Is it really that good?" Julian glanced at the young man. There wasn't even a grain of rice left on the plate. It was as if the plate had been licked clean. "Master Turtle Shell, don't you like rainbow fried rice?" Amy looked at Julian and asked doubtfully. "That guy can't eat meat. I guess he hasn't tasted meat for 100 years. Crassus, who had already eaten half a bowl of Yangzhou fried rice, looked at Julian with pity. He knew a little about what happened in the past. He was also on the Demon Islands when the cannibals were exterminated. Most of the survivors who escaped died at his hands. He did not hate demons, but there was no need for demons that specialized in feeding on humans to survive in this world. Even if the race war ended, those guys would definitely not stop. The battle between ice and fire had attracted a lot of attention on the Norland continent. Everyone thought that the two of them were sworn enemies who would kill each other as soon as they met. However, how many people knew that the two of them had worked together to do a few things that no one knew about? The annihilation of the ogres had always been an unsolved mystery. "If you can't eat meat, you'll be so pitiful." Amy looked at Julian pitifully. "Who said I can't eat meat?" Being looked at with pity by Julian and Amy, Julian's blood boiled. He grabbed the spoon next to him, and dug a spoonful from the middle. When he reached his mouth, he stopped. The tantalizing aroma wafted into his nose. Julian's appetite had been awakened by the delicious bowl of tofu pudding. He looked at Amy, who was full of expectation, and gritted his teeth. He opened his mouth and ate the fried rice. How can it taste like this? Meat can be so delicious. Julian's eyes widened. The egg wrapped around the rice almost melted in his mouth. After biting into the ham that had been marinated for many years, the savory and fragrant gravy flowed out. Julian, who could not remember the taste of meat at all, felt all his taste buds awaken at once. They were cheering and welcoming the return of their king. Although they were only a few grains of rice, the deep and special taste shocked Crassus like never before. It awakened the strongest feeling in the depths of his heart. He suddenly remembered something. Before that incident, he was a person who couldn't be without meat. In addition to the ham, the shrimp mixed with the freshness of the sea, the rice-sized mushrooms, winter bamboo shoots, and chives. The taste was so delicious and harmonious that it brought wave after wave of taste buds that had been dormant for a long time to the top of the clouds. What surprised him even more was the faint fragrance of the spring of life contained in the rice. Those who had never tasted the spring of life might think it was just some kind of seasoning, but he had tasted it before. He just didn't expect Meg to be able to get his hands on the spring of life and add it to the dish just like that. Ah! Julian couldn't help but exclaim after swallowing a mouthful of Yangzhou fried rice. His attention was completely attracted by the bowl of Yangzhou fried rice in front of him. He scooped another spoonful into his mouth, one mouthful after another. He couldn't stop at all. Turtle Grandpa seems to be eating very happily. He doesn't seem to dislike it. Amy also smiled. I can only say that Mr. Mac's food is too delicious. Crassus was also a little surprised. He didn't expect that Julian, who had never eaten meat, would really eat the Yangzhou fried rice with ham in it. And from the looks of it, he was completely addicted to it. But on second thought, when he was in Rodu, he could only eat half a bowl of rice. After coming here, he had 2 bowls of Yangzhou fried rice for every meal, which was the same as Julian's. Ding! The spoon touched the plate and made a soft sound. Julian was stunned for a moment. Then he realized that he had finished the Yangzhou fried rice. He actually finished a bowl of food with meat in it. And he didn't feel any nausea after eating it. He even had the urge to eat another bowl. Julian didn't know how many years he hadn't had this feeling. His heart couldn't help but beat faster. He couldn't help but look at the rugiamo on the side. This was also a dish he had never seen before. The white bread was cut in the middle and stuffed with minced meat. When Julian first saw this dish, he rejected it in his heart. It was too greasy and full of meat. But after eating the Yangzhou fried rice, he suddenly had a strong desire for meat. The minced ham in the Yangzhou fried rice couldn't satisfy him anymore. This rugiamo was obviously more suitable. This taste. Will it be different from the meat I ate before? Julian was a little hesitant as he reached for the rugiamo. The rich aroma of the braised meat wafted to his face. It was indeed different from the ham, but it was just as tempting. He couldn't help but take a bite. Some braised meat sauce had seeped into the soft biji bread. It was sweet with a little salty taste. The soft braised meat almost melted in his mouth. Although it was a mixture of fat and lean meat, it didn't feel greasy at all. The rich sauce oozed out of the meat and completely ignited the restless taste buds. It was like a carnival. The aroma of the meat wreaked havoc in his mouth, and then turned into a violent breath that rushed into his body. Ah! Julian couldn't help but let out a long sigh. Looking at the rugiamo in his hand, his eyes lit up. His blood was gushing, and his heart was beating wildly. This was the feeling of being young. At that time, he also liked to run around in a white robe, thinking that he was a righteous and lucky magician, a hero. Starting from today, at least 4 chapters. But the number of subscriptions these days is a little low. Where is the motivation to publish more chapters? It said that Chidian gave out a lot of free coins. Don't tell me people are using the free coins to subscribe. Free coins to subscribe. Whisper doesn't get a penny, and the average subscription rate doesn't increase. The new books are dying out. This is a little embarrassing. From today on, Whisper promises to publish more chapters. If she's healthy, she'll keep publishing until the end of the month. Can you also promise me that you won't use the free coins to subscribe to the restaurant?